The year was 1877, and winter came like judgment to the Dakota Hills. Early, bitter, and without mercy, snow drifted across the rolling landscape in long, sighing sweeps, covering everything in a shroud of white forgetfulness. Pines groaned under their burden, and the wind sang like a widow too long alone. Jackson Miles stood on the porch of his cabin, rifle steady in his weathered hands. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, each exhale joining the swirling snow. Before him, 6 men and 1 woman stood in a ragged half-circle, their faces hard as the frozen ground beneath their boots. "I won't let you take her," Jackson said, his voice low and level as the horizon. Thomas Reed stepped forward, his tall frame imposing even in the gathering darkness. The steel in his eyes matched the barrel of the pistol at his hip. "That child has Bennett blood. She belongs with family, not with the man who killed her father." Behind Jackson, through the cabin's single window, the soft glow of firelight revealed Sarah Bennett, pale and exhausted, clutching a small bundle to her chest. Her eyes met Jackson's back, seeing only the rigid set of his shoulders, the last barrier between her child and the world that had left her to die. The sheriff, Lucas Porter, shifted uncomfortably, snow crunching beneath his boots. "Let's all just calm down now," he said, but his words scattered in the wind like fallen leaves. Jackson didn't move. 3 weeks earlier, he wouldn't have imagined standing here ready to cheer for a woman and child he barely knew. But that was before he found her singing in the snow. That was before everything changed. 3 weeks earlier, the morning broke reluctant over the hills, the sun a pale ghost behind cloud-thick skies. Jackson Miles rode his dappled gelding sergeant with a measured pace of a man who knew solitude better than conversation. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he had grown accustomed to discomfort long ago. 7 years since Antietam. 7 years since he'd watched men die under his hands, their blood slipping through his fingers faster than he could staunch the flow. 7 years of quiet and whiskey and waking in the night to phantom screams. The war had ended for the country, but for Jackson, it simply changed battlefields, moving from open fields to the territory inside his skull. He wasn't heading anywhere particular, just checking his trap lines, maybe hunting if opportunity presented itself. The nearest settlement, Willow Gap, lay half a day's ride south, but he visited only when supplies demanded it. The townsfolk had learned not to expect pleasantries from the taciturn former Army surgeon who lived alone in the hills. Sergeant's ears flicked forward suddenly, and the horse snorted, sending twin jets of steam into the crisp air. Jackson stilled, following the animal's gaze. There, cutting across the unblemished white of a small clearing, footprints. Human, uneven, and stained with something dark that could only be blood. Jackson dismounted, his movements deliberate. He touched the prints with gloved fingers, noting their freshness, a few hours old at most. The blood was still red against the snow, not yet oxidized to brown. Someone had passed this way recently, injured and alone. His first instinct was to remount and continue on his way. Other people's troubles were no longer his concern. He'd seen enough suffering in the war to last several lifetimes. But something about the erratic pattern of the footprints, the way they staggered and straightened, spoke of desperation. With a soft curse that clouded before him, Jackson led Sergeant by the reins and followed the trail. It wound through a stand of pines where the snow lay thinner beneath the sheltering boughs. The blood spots grew more frequent, no longer just occasional drops, but smears that told of someone leaning against tree trunks for support. The tracks led to a small hollow where the ground dipped between 2 fallen logs. At first, Jackson thought he was looking at a bundle of discarded cloth half covered by drifting snow. Then he saw the hand-pale fingers curled like winter-killed leaves, wrists rubbed raw, encrusted with blood, where rope had cut into flesh. A woman lay there, her dress a thin cotton thing, wholly inadequate for the bitter cold. Dark hair spilled across the snow, tangled with ice crystals that caught the weak sunlight. Her eyes were closed, lips blue-tinged, but a faint mist of breath proved life still clung to her. Most striking of all was the swell of her belly, pronounced even beneath the snow dusting her form. She was heavily pregnant. Jackson knelt beside her, professional instinct taking over as he pressed fingers to her throat, feeling for a pulse. It fluttered weakly against his touch, a bird trapped in a closing fist. "Ma'am," he said, the word awkward on his tongue after so many days of speaking to no one but himself and Sergeant. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, then opened to reveal eyes the color of summer storms, a gray-blue that seemed startlingly vibrant against her pallid face. She didn't flinch at the sight of a stranger, didn't cry out. There was no strength left for fear. Instead, her cracked lips parted, and a sound emerged that froze Jackson more effectively than the winter air. She was singing, barely audible, more breath than voice, but unmistakably a melody. 3 notes wavering and weak before her voice failed. Jackson knew that song, had heard it countless times in another life from another woman's lips. Shenandoah, the old river song that Eleanor had loved that she had hummed while tending their small garden, while mending his shirts, while cradling her swollen belly in the months before she died, bringing their child into a world that would never know either of them. The woman's eyes focused on him with surprising clarity. Can I? She whispered each word at a visible effort. Give birth in your cabin, no plea, no begging. Just a simple question asked, as if the answer mattered less than the asking. Jackson stared at her, at the rope marks on her wrists, at the belly that housed a life somehow still fighting, despite everything. He didn't speak. Instead, he shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her, then gently slid his arms beneath her shoulders and knees. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones, in the precious cargo she carried. As he lifted her, her head lolled against his chest, and he caught a faint scent beneath the cold lavender, perhaps a memory of warmer days. My name is Sarah, she murmured against the rough wool of his shirt. Sarah Bennett. Jackson settled her carefully on Sargent, keeping one hand on her back to steady her as they began the slow journey back to his cabin. He didn't tell her his name, didn't promise help beyond what he was already giving, didn't speak at all. But as they made their way through the silent forest, he found himself listening for her breathing, marking each exhale as a small victory against the cold that sought to claim her. The cabin sat nestled against a ridge that sheltered it from the worst of the northerly winds. It was a simple structure, one room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with two chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves lined with the necessities of survival. Not much, but enough for a man who had stopped needing comfort years ago. By the time they arrived, the light was already fading from the sky. Sarah had drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, sometimes humming fragments of that haunting melody, sometimes silent, except for the shallow rhythm of her breathing. Jackson carried her inside and placed her gently on his bed, then moved with practiced efficiency to build up the fire. The kindling caught quickly, hungry flames licking at the seasoned pine logs, until the hearth blazed with welcome heat. He hung a kettle of snow to melt and warm. When he turned back to Sarah, her eyes were open again, watching him with that same uncanny clarity. The firelight played across her features, bringing life to skin that had seemed nearly translucent in the snow. She was younger than he'd first thought, mid-20s perhaps, with a delicate bone structure that spoke of refinement despite her current state. Thank you, she said softly. Jackson nodded once, acknowledging her words without inviting more. He poured the warmed water into a tin cup and added a spoonful of the precious sugar he kept for treating shock. Approaching the bed, he held the cup to her lips. Small sips, he instructed, his voice rough from disuse. She obeyed, wincing slightly as the warm liquid met her cracked lips. After a few careful swallows, she turned her face away and he set the cup aside. They said I wasn't fit, she whispered, to birth a child in a God-fearing town. Jackson didn't respond. He busied himself preparing a thin broth, adding dried vegetables and a small portion of salted venison to the pot. The familiar motions of cooking allowed him to keep his back to her to avoid whatever pain might be visible in those storm-colored eyes. I didn't steal anything, she continued, as if answering an accusation he hadn't made. Didn't do what they said. The broth began to simmer, filling the cabin with a rich aroma that momentarily masked the sense of wood smoke and solitude. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the chinks in the winch despite his careful patching. Willow Gap, he asked, finally naming the nearest settlement. She nodded, then winced at the movement. You know it. Enough to aside it when I can. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, there and gone, like sunlight through clouds. Wise man. He brought her a bowl of broth and helped her to sit up, supporting her back with his rolled blanket. She ate slowly, each spoonful seeming to require deliberate concentration. Her hands trembled, but she refused his offer to help. As night deepened outside, the fire popped and crackled, filling the silences between them. Jackson sat in the room's only armchair, whittling a piece of pine without any clear purpose, simply keeping his hands busy while his mind circled around the woman in his bed. You were a doctor, she said suddenly. Not a question. Jackson's knife stilled. How did you know? The way you checked my pulse. How you made me drink the sugar water before the broth. Her gaze was steady. My father was a doctor in St. Louis. He resumed his carving, shavings curling away from the blade and falling to the floor like pale imitations of the snow outside. Army surgeon, not the same thing. During the war, he nodded, not looking up. Which side, she asked, and there was something in her voice that made him meet her eyes. Union, he said, watching for her reaction. She nodded as if confirming something to herself. My husband fought for the Confederacy, she said. He never forgave the world for losing. Jackson understood then, or thought he did. A Southern woman in a Northern territory married to a bitter Confederate veteran. It would have been enough to make her an outsider in a place like Willow Gap. He's dead now, she added, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. 2 years passed. A widow then, pregnant with a child whose father was 2 years in the grave. No wonder the town had turned against her. Rural communities guarded their morals fiercely, especially when embodied in the swollen belly of a beautiful widow. They tied me up behind the livery, she said, her voice dropping so low he had to strain to hear. Said, let the snow decide. She tried to laugh, but it transformed into a cough that shook her slender frame. Jackson rose and brought her more water, standing awkwardly by the bedside until the spasm passed. I used to sing, she said later, tracing the rim of the cup with one finger. Back when folks still looked me in the eye. He took the empty cup from her hands. You still do. Her brow furrowed in confusion. In the snow, he explained, you were singing Shenandoah. Was I? A faraway look crossed her face. My mother used to sing that. I don't remember. It must have been the cold. Jackson turned away, setting the cup on the table with more force than necessary. You should rest. She didn't argue, settling back against the pillow, her eyelids already growing heavy. What's your name? She murmured, sleep beginning to claim her. He hesitated at the door, one hand on the latch. Jackson. Jackson Miles. Thank you, Dr. Miles, she whispered, but he was already outside, closing the door on her words. The night air struck him like a physical blow, but he welcomed the cold. It cleared his head, pushing back the memories that her singing had dredged up from the depths where he'd buried them. He stood on the porch, looking up at stars scattered like broken glass across the black velvet of the sky. She doesn't belong here, Eleanor, he said softly to the emptiness. I don't know what to do with her. The wind answered with a low moan through the pines, neither guidance nor reproach. Just the endless voice of a winter that cared nothing for the troubles of humans. When the cold finally drove him back inside, Sarah was asleep, her breathing deeper and more regular. The firelight gilded her dark hair spread across his pillow, and for a moment the sight was so domestic, so achingly familiar, that Jackson had to look away. He made a pallet for himself near the hearth rifle within easy reach, habit, not expectation. As he settled onto the hard floor, his gaze fell upon the small, wooden figure taking shape beneath his knife. Without conscious intention, he had been carving a bird, a sparrow perhaps, or a wren. A small thing easily broken, yet built to survive winter's worst. He set it aside unfinished and closed his eyes, knowing sleep would be long in coming. Dawn arrived with a temporary reprieve from the snow, the sky a clear, brittle blue that promised even deeper cold. Jackson rose before first light, his body stiff from the hard floor and uneasy dreams. Sarah still slept, her face relaxed in the pale glow of morning, one hand curled protectively over her belly. He added wood to the banked coals, coaxed the fire back to life, then moved quietly about his morning routine, melting snow for water setting, coffee to boil, checking his stores. Ordinary tasks made strange by the presence of the sleeping woman. When he glanced over again, her eyes were open, watching him with that same unnerving directness. Morning, he said, the greeting awkward on his tongue. Good morning, Dr. Miles. Her voice sounded stronger today, though still rasped from cold and thirst. Just Jackson, he corrected, pouring coffee into a tin mug. I haven't been a doctor in a long time. He brought her the coffee, helping her sit up, when her arms trembled with the effort. She accepted the mug with a murmured thanks, inhaling the steam rising from the dark liquid as if it were the finest perfume. How far along are you? He asked, nodding toward her belly. 8 months, I think. Maybe a little more. She sipped the coffee, closing her eyes briefly in appreciation. It's hard to keep track of time sometimes. Jackson frowned. The child was further along than he'd thought, dangerously close to term. The baby moves regular, she nodded. More when I'm near the fire, like she remembers warmth. A small smile curved Sarah's lips. Just a feeling. Jackson nodded, accepting her intuition without comment. He'd seen enough of birth during the war. Field hospitals weren't particular about keeping women away from the wounded, to know that mothers often sensed things about their unborn children that defied medical explanation. I need to check your hands and feet, he said. Make sure there's no frostbite. She extended her hands without hesitation, trusting him with a directness that made him uncomfortable. He took them in his, noting the rope burns around her wrists, the reddened fingertips that suggested the early stages of frostbite, but not the waxy white of dead tissue. Wiggle your fingers for me, he instructed, watching as she complied. Feel any numbness, burning? A little tingling, she admitted, but I can feel your hands if that's what you're asking. He released her, satisfied that she hadn't lost any digits to the cold. Your feet now. She pulled back the blanket, revealing feet clad in thin, worn shoes wholly inadequate for winter. He removed them carefully, his clinical gaze assessing the damage. Like her hands, her feet showed signs of cold exposure, but no permanent damage. You're lucky, he said, covering her feet again. Another hour out there and you'd have lost toes at least. I don't feel very lucky, she said quietly. Jackson straightened, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment, her in his bed, him touching her bare feet. He stepped back, putting proper distance between them. You need rest, food, warmth. He moved to the stove, focusing on the practical. I have porridge, some dried apples. I don't want to be a burden, she said, and there was a note in her voice that made him turn back to her, pride perhaps, or simple dignity. You're not, he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. Not yet, anyway. That earned him another fleeting smile. I'll try to keep it that way. While the porridge cooked, Jackson stoked the fire higher and hung a kettle of water to heat. You should wash when you feel strong enough, he said, not looking at her. There's soap, and I might have a shirt that would fit you better than that dress. He didn't mention that the shirt had been Eleanor's, packed away in a trunk he rarely opened. Some things didn't need saying. They ate in a silence that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Jackson at the table, Sarah propped up in bed. She ate slowly but steadily, color gradually returning to her cheeks as warmth and nourishment did their work. Will they come looking for me? She asked suddenly, setting aside her empty bowl. Jackson considered the question. Depends on whether they left you to die or just to think about your sins. Is there a difference? Intent, he said simply. Some folks just want to scare sense into people. Others, he let the sentence trail off, the unspoken alternatives hanging in the air between them. Sarah nodded, understanding what he couldn't bring himself to say. They thought the child was conceived in sin, she said, her hand returning to her belly in that unconscious protective gesture. Said what I carried was shame, not life. Jackson had seen enough of humanity's capacity for cruelty to believe her. Small towns could be as merciless as any battlefield when it came to enforcing their codes of conduct. Who's the father? He asked, the question blunt but necessary, her eyes darkened, storm clouds gathering. My husband, they said. A miracle or a lie, depending on who you asked. She looked away. The truth is more complicated. Before he could press further, a low growl rumbled from beneath the table. Jackson glanced down to see his old hound scout, who had been sleeping by the fire, now alert and staring at the door, hackles raised. Someone's coming, Jackson said, rising and reaching for his rifle in one fluid motion. Stay quiet. He moved to the window, careful to keep to the side where he wouldn't be silhouetted against the glass. At first, he saw nothing but the unbroken expanse of snow surrounding the cabin. Then a movement caught his eye, a flash of dark against white, quickly gone. Scout growled again, deeper this time. How many? Sarah whispered from the bed, her face gone pale again. Jackson shook his head, eyes still scanning the tree line. Can't tell. At least one. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited, the only sound Scout's low rumbling and the pop of wood in the fireplace. Then from the corner of his eye, Jackson caught another movement, a figure darting between trees, keeping to the shadows. They followed my tracks, Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. From where you found me. It was possible. The clear weather would have made the trail easy to follow even for someone with limited tracking skills. Jackson silently cursed himself for not covering their path better. The figure moved again, closer now, and this time Jackson caught a clear glimpse, a man tall and broad-shouldered, with a rifle of his own cradled in his arms. He kept to the edge of the clearing, circling the cabin like a wolf sizing up its prey. You know him? Jackson asked, keeping his voice low. Sarah had managed to rise from the bed and now stood unsteadily beside him, peering out the window. She gasped softly. Thomas Reed, she whispered. My husband's brother. The name meant nothing to Jackson, but the fear in her voice told him everything he needed to know. What does he want? Me, or rather, her hand moved protectively to her belly. What I carry. Before Jackson could respond, Scout barked sharply, a warning. Outside, the man had stopped his circling and now stood directly before the cabin, some 20 yards away. Close enough that Jackson could make out his features, a hard face beneath a wide-brimmed hat and eyes narrowed against the glare of sun on snow. For a long moment, the man simply stood there, staring at the cabin as if he could see through its walls. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised one gloved hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning. Jackson didn't wave back. He remained motionless at the window, rifle ready, but not yet raised. A standoff in silence with only the vast white landscape as witness. Finally, the man turned and walked away, disappearing back into the trees with the same measured stride. Scout's growling subsided, but the dog remained alert, ears pricked forward. He's gone, Jackson said, though he kept watching the tree line. For now. Sarah sank onto the chair, her brief strength exhausted. He'll be back, she said, certainty in every word. With others, probably. Why? Jackson turned to her, searching her face. What does he want with your child? Sarah looked up at him, her storm gray eyes filled with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. Family legacy, she said bitterly, the Bennett name. Thomas has no children of his own, and my husband was the last of the line. This child, she placed both hands on her belly, is the only future the Bennett name has. And he tracked you all the way here for that. You don't understand what the name means in Willow Gap, she said. The Bennetts founded the town. They owned the mill, half the businesses. Jim, my husband, was going to inherit everything before he died. Her mouth twisted. Thomas got it all instead, but he can't bear the thought of the name dying with him. Jackson processed this information, fitting it into the picture that was slowly forming. A powerful family, a dead heir, a widow carrying the last Bennett blood. It made a certain ruthless sense. How did your husband die? He asked the question, seemingly unrelated, but nagging at him nonetheless. Something flickered in Sarah's eyes, a shadow of an emotion he couldn't name. A fight, she said, in the saloon, 2 years ago. Jackson stilled a cold that had nothing to do with the winter seeping into his bones. In Willow Gap. She nodded, watching him closely now. You've heard of it. He turned away, unable to meet her gaze. I've heard of most things that happen in Willow Gap eventually, he said, the half-truth bitter on his tongue. Outside, the sun had risen fully, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The man Thomas Reed was nowhere to be seen, but his presence lingered like a threat. You should lie down again, Jackson said, deliberately changing the subject. Save your strength. Sarah didn't move. He won't stop, she said. Not until he has what he wants. Then we'll have to make sure he doesn't get it. The words came without thought, a commitment he hadn't intended to make, but couldn't take back once spoken. The question held surprise, hope, and doubt in equal measure. Jackson met her eyes, then seeing the fear there, but also a determination that matched his own. Yes, he said simply, we. And in that moment, with sunlight streaming through the window and the echo of a dead man's name hanging between them, Jackson Miles made the first promise he'd given anyone since Eleanor died. He didn't speak it aloud, didn't need to. Sarah Bennett saw it in his eyes and nodded once, accepting the unspoken vow. Outside, the world was white and still a deceptive peace, broken only by a single set of footprints leading away from the cabin and the certainty that they would soon return multiplied. The days that followed settled into an uneasy routine. Sarah regained her strength, gradually moving from bed to chair, then taking cautious steps around the cabin. Jackson watched her progress with the clinical eye of his former profession, noting improvements and setbacks with equal attention. He taught her to use his rifle, a Winchester repeater that had seen him through the years since the war. Her hands were smaller than his, delicate, despite the calluses that spoke of harder work than a lady should know, but she handled the weapon with a natural grace that surprised him. My father believed women should know how to protect themselves, she explained when he commented on her ease with the firearm. Said the world was changing, and a lady couldn't always count on a gentleman being around when trouble came. Wise man, Jackson said, echoing her earlier assessment of him. They stood in the clearing behind the cabin, Sarah bundled in his spare coat, her breath clouding the air, as she sighted down the barrel at the target he'd set up, an old tin can perched on a stump. The day was clear and cold, the sky a blue so deep it almost hurt to look at. Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger, he instructed, standing close enough to steady her if needed, but far enough to give her space to move. Don't pull, just squeeze like you're pressing a ripe berry between your fingers. She nodded, focused on the target. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and the rifle cracked, sending echoes bouncing off the surrounding hills. The can jumped and fell. Good, Jackson said, surprised at the pride in his voice. Very good. Sarah lowered the rifle, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Again. He reset the target, and they continued for another hour until her arms trembled with fatigue and her cheeks were flushed with cold and satisfaction. 5 shots out of 7 had found their mark, not perfect, but better than many men he'd known. Enough for today, he said, finally taking the rifle from her. Don't want to tire you out. As they walked back to the cabin, their shoulders occasionally brushing, Jackson was struck by how quickly he'd become accustomed to her presence. The silences between them were comfortable now, no longer weighted with the awkwardness of strangers. At night, he still slept on the floor near the hearth, leaving the bed to Sarah. Sometimes he would wake to find her watching the fire, one hand resting on her belly, her lips moving in a silent song. Other times he would hear her humming softly in her sleep, always the same melody, Shenandoah, the river song that Eleanor had loved. Those nights he would lie awake until dawn, haunted by memories he'd thought safely buried. On the 5th day, he decided he needed to go into Willow Gap. Their supplies were holding, but Sarah needed things he couldn't provide, proper clothes for her, and the coming child medicines. He didn't have food more suited to a woman in her condition than his bachelor fare. I don't like it, Sarah said when he told her his plan. Thomas could be waiting. Probably is, Jackson agreed, checking his pistol before tucking it into his belt. But we need to know what we're facing. Better to find out on my terms than his. She couldn't argue with the logic, but worry creased her brow as she watched him prepare. Be careful, she said finally. I can't. She stopped swallowing whatever she had been about to say. Jackson paused in the doorway, looking back at her, the morning light caught in her dark hair, illuminating strands of auburn he hadn't noticed before. I'll be back before dark, he promised. Keep Scout with you, and the rifle's loaded. She nodded, trying to smile. I'll have dinner waiting. The domesticity of the statement struck him like a physical blow, so normal, so ordinary, yet so far removed from the life he'd lived these past 7 years. He nodded once, unable to find words, and stepped out into the cold. Sergeant was restless, eager to run after days in the small corral behind the cabin. Jackson let the horse set the pace as they descended from the hills toward the valley, where Willow Gap nestled beside the frozen creek that gave the town its name. The settlement came into view as they crested a low rise, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a single main street, smoke rising from chimneys in thin gray columns against the blue sky. From this distance, it looked peaceful, even welcoming. Jackson knew better. He entered town at a walk, keeping Sergeant to a sedate pace despite the horse's desire to trot. Eyes tracked his progress from windows and doorways. Willow Gap didn't get many visitors in winter, and Jackson's rare appearances always drew attention. The general store stood in the center of town, a 2-story building with a covered porch and large windows displaying goods that ranged from practical to frivolous. Jackson tied Sergeant to the hitching post, patted the horse's neck, and stepped up onto the porch, boots echoing on the wooden planks. Inside, the store was warm and smelled of coffee, tobacco, and the mingled scents of spices and leather. Behind the counter, Harold Parker looked up from his ledger, recognition and wariness crossing his round face in equal measure. Miles, he said by way of greeting. Been a while. Jackson nodded, glancing around the nearly empty store. An elderly woman examined bolts of fabric in one corner, and a young boy sat near the stove playing with a tin soldier. Need a few things, Jackson said, approaching the counter. He placed a list on the scarred wood surface, written in his precise hand, detailing the items he required. Parker picked it up, eyebrows rising as he read. Feminine things, he noted, looking up at Jackson with undisguised curiosity. And baby clothes. He set the list down, his expression carefully neutral. Folks say you're keeping her, the Bennett woman. So they knew. Jackson wasn't surprised news traveled fast in small communities, and Thomas Reed would have made sure everyone heard of Sarah's whereabouts. She needed help, he said simply. Parker's gaze sharpened. She's trouble, Miles. Her and that baby both. You're mixing in something best left alone. Just need the supplies, Parker. Jackson kept his voice level, though his hand twitched toward the pistol at his belt. Not advice, but birds. The storekeeper held his gaze for a moment longer, then shrugged and began gathering the items on the list. Your funeral, he muttered, but low enough that Jackson could pretend not to hear. As Parker worked, the bell above the door jingled, announcing a new arrival. Jackson didn't turn, but he felt the atmosphere in the store shift, grow tenser. The elderly woman by the fabric bolts gathered her purchases hurriedly and moved to the counter, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Well, look who's come to town, a deep voice drawled from behind him. The hermit of Dakota Hills himself. Now Jackson did turn, facing the newcomer with the same calm he'd faced enemy fire during the war. Thomas Reed stood in the doorway, filling it with his broad frame. He wore a heavy coat of good quality, a hat pulled low over his brow, and an expression that might have been friendly if not for the coldness in his eyes. Reed, Jackson acknowledged with a slight nod. Heard you found something of mine, Reed said, stepping fully into the store and letting the door swing shut behind him. Or someone, rather. Found a woman half dead in the snow, Jackson corrected. Didn't see your name on her. Reed smiled, a tight stretching of lips that never reached his eyes. My brother's widow, carrying my brother's child. That makes her family, and family takes care of its own. Is that what you call leaving her tied up in a blizzard? Taking her? A flicker of something, anger perhaps, or embarrassment crossed Reed's face before he controlled it. Town justice. Not my doing, though I can't say she didn't earn it. He moved closer, his voice dropping. She's not what she seems, Miles. Best you know that before you get in too deep. Jackson held his ground, refusing to be intimidated by the larger man. Seems like a woman who needs help to me. That's all I need to know. Reed's smile disappeared entirely. That child she's carrying is a Bennett, last of the line. It belongs here with its family. Child's not born yet, Jackson pointed out. When it is, the mother will decide where it belongs. Will she? Reed's voice held a note of amusement that raised the hairs on the back of Jackson's neck. You might want to ask her about Jim's death before you start playing protector. Ask her where she was that night, what she was doing while my brother bled out on a saloon floor. Before Jackson could respond, the door opened again, admitting a gust of cold air and the town sheriff, Lucas Porter. A thin man with a weathered face and tired eyes, Porter took in the scene with the wariness of someone who had broken up his share of conflicts. "Gentlemen," he said, nodding to each of them, "everything peaceful in here, I trust." "Just having a friendly conversation," Reed said, his posture relaxing slightly. "Isn't that right, Miles?" Jackson didn't answer. He turned back to the counter where Parker had finished assembling his order. "How much?" he asked the storekeeper. Parker named a sum that was higher than it should have been, but Jackson paid without comment, gathering the parcels into a burlap sack. He could feel Reed's eyes on his back, watching every move. "Miles," Sheriff Porter said as Jackson headed for the door. "Got a minute?" Jackson paused, glancing between the sheriff and Reed. Porter jerked his head toward the door, indicating he wanted to speak outside. With a final look at Reed, Jackson nodded and followed the lawman onto the porch. The day had warmed slightly, the sun doing its best against the winter chill. Porter led him to the end of the porch where they could speak without being overheard by anyone inside the store. "You've stepped in it now, Miles," the sheriff said without preamble. "Taking in the Bennett woman." "Didn't have much choice," Jackson replied. "She would have died out there." Porter sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled chin. "Maybe that would have been cleaner in the long run." He held up a hand as Jackson bristled. "Not saying it would have been right, just cleaner." "What do you want, Sheriff?" "To warn you." Porter glanced back at the store where Reed could be seen, through the window, engaged in conversation with Parker. "Thomas Reed has influence in this town, money, friends in high places, and he wants that baby. I gathered that much. He's making a case that she's unfit," Porter continued, "that the child will need a proper upbringing, religious, respectable." He emphasized the words with a grimace that suggested his personal feelings differed from the official line. "On what grounds?" Jackson demanded. Porter hesitated, then lowered his voice further. "There's talk about Jim Bennett's death, about Sarah's involvement." A cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled in Jackson's stomach. "She said he died in a fight." "He did, but there's more to it than that." Porter glanced around again, then leaned closer. "Look, I'm not saying she did anything wrong. Jim Bennett was a mean drunk and a worse husband. Everyone knew it, even if no one said it out loud. But Thomas has been spinning a tale that casts her as something darker. And people believe him." Porter spread his hands in a helpless gesture. "People believe what's convenient, what fits their view of the world. And it's easier to blame a pretty young widow than admit one of the town's leading citizens was a wife-beating bastard." Jackson absorbed this information, fitting it into the growing puzzle of Sarah Bennett and the circumstances that had led her to his cabin. "Is that why the town left her to die? Because they think she had something to do with her husband's death?" "Partly," Porter admitted. "That and the baby, the timing. Well, it raised questions. Jim had been dead almost 7 months when folks realized she was with child. She claimed it was his that she was already carrying when he died, but you do the math." The implication was clear. Either Sarah had been pregnant before her husband died, entirely possible, or the child had been conceived after his death, making her an adulteress as well as a suspected murderer in the eyes of the town. "What do you think?" Jackson asked, studying the sheriff's face. Porter sighed again, his breath fogging in the cold air. "I think this town is too quick to judge and too slow to forgive. And I think Thomas Reed wants that child because it's the only way he can control what's left of his brother's legacy." He straightened, adjusting his coat. "But what I think doesn't matter much. Just be careful, Miles. Reed won't stop at talk." With that warning, Porter tipped his hat and descended the steps, moving down the street toward the small building that served as both jail and sheriff's office. Jackson remained on the porch, the burlap sack heavy in his hands. The conversation had raised more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Sarah Bennett's situation was more complicated than she had let on, and the danger more immediate than he had realized. He untied Sargent, secured his purchases, and mounted, eager to be away from the watching eyes of Willow Gap. As he turned the horse toward home, he caught sight of Thomas Reed standing in the doorway of the general store, his cold gaze following Jackson's departure. It wasn't until he was well clear of town that Jackson realized he'd begun thinking of the cabin as home, not just a place he lived, but somewhere he was returning to, somewhere someone was waiting for him. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. The sun was already low in the sky by the time the cabin came into view, smoke rising steadily from the chimney windows glowing with the warm light of lamps within. It looked like a painting of domesticity against the wild backdrop of the hills, a scene from another man's life, not the one Jackson had resigned himself to after Eleanor's death. As he dismounted, the door opened, and Sarah stood framed in the golden light, one hand braced against the jamb, the other resting on the swell of her belly. Relief washed over her face at the sight of him, quickly masked but unmistakable. "You're back," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. Jackson stamped the snow from his boots and carried his purchases inside, setting them on the table. The cabin was warm, filled with the aroma of something savory. She had made a stew from the remaining vegetables and salted meat, he realized. "Any trouble?" she asked, closing the door against the gathering darkness. He considered how much to tell her, how much she already knew. "I met your brother-in-law," he said finally, watching her face carefully. Sarah stilled her hand, moving instinctively to her belly. "Thomas," she said, the name flat on her tongue. "What did he want?" "You know what he wants." Jackson began unpacking his purchases: cloth diapers, a small baby gown, a softer blanket than his rough army-issued dried fruit tea, and other necessities. "The child. Your child. He can't have her." The fierceness in her voice made him look up. She stood straighter now, chin raised in defiance, all trace of the half-frozen woman he had found in the snow gone. "I won't let him take her." "I spoke to Sheriff Porter, too." Jackson continued, setting aside the baby items to unpack the food. "He said there's talk about your husband's death, about your involvement." The color drained from Sarah's face, but she didn't look away. "Of course there is," she said bitterly. "It's easier to blame the wife than admit what kind of man Jim Bennett really was." "And what kind of man was he?" "Yeah." Sarah moved to the fire, staring into the flames as if they held answers to questions not yet asked. "The kind who used his fists more often than words. The kind who drank away his war bitterness and brought it home to share." She turned back to Jackson, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "The kind who couldn't stand the thought that his wife might have a voice of her own." Jackson nodded, unsurprised. He'd seen enough of humanity's capacity for cruelty to believe her without question. And the night he died. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the crack and pop of the fire. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice so low he had to strain to hear. "I was singing," she said, "at the saloon. Jim had lost our farm after the war, gambling, mostly. I took work where I could find it. The owner of the White Stag liked my voice, said I reminded him of his daughter back east." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "3 nights a week I'd sing old ballads, folk songs. The miners liked it. So did the cowboys passing through." She moved to the table, running her fingers over the soft fabric of the baby gown Jackson had purchased. "Jim hated it. Said it made him look weak, having his wife perform like a common—" She cut herself off, but Jackson could fill in the word. "But we needed the money, and for once I didn't bend." Her gaze met his, challenging him to judge her. "That night he came in drunk, worse than usual, started shouting, saying terrible things. When Mr. Holloway, the owner, tried to intervene, Jim hit him. Then everything happened so fast. Another man stepped in. There was a scuffle, a knife." She shook her head. "By the time it was over, Jim was bleeding out on the floor, and everyone was looking at me like I'd planned it." "Did you know the man who stepped in?" Jackson asked, his mouth suddenly dry. Sarah held his gaze steadily. "No," she said. "He was just passing through. A stranger." But something in her eyes, a flicker of awareness, perhaps made him wonder if she was telling the complete truth. "The town blames you," he said, "for his death." "The town needed someone to blame," she corrected. "Jim was one of them, a Bennett. I was always an outsider, and when I started showing—" Her hand moved to her belly. "The timing gave them what they needed. Proof of my wickedness." Jackson frowned. "The sheriff mentioned that. Said the timing raised questions about the father." Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Of course it did. Never mind that I was already with child when Jim died. Never mind that I'd hidden it from him because I feared what he'd do in one of his rages." Her voice broke slightly. "All they saw was a widow who must have been unfaithful, carrying another man's child." "And were you—" The question escaped before Jackson could consider its propriety. "Unfaithful." Her eyes flashed. "Would it matter if I was? After everything Jim did, every bruise, every broken bone, every night I spent praying he wouldn't wake and start again." Jackson had no answer for that. He thought of the women he'd treated during the war, not just the wounds from bullets and shells, but the older injuries they carried, inflicted by those who claimed to love them. "No," he said finally, "it wouldn't matter to me." Something in Sarah's expression softened. "Then that's enough," she said quietly. "For now." Outside, darkness had fallen completely the early winter night, wrapping the cabin in its cold embrace. Inside, the fire cast long shadows on the walls, and the stew bubbled gently on the stove, filling the room with its homely scent. Sarah moved to check on the food, her earlier tension seemingly set aside. "Dinner's nearly ready," she said, her voice deliberately light. "I hope you're hungry." Jackson watched her, this woman who had survived abandonment, cold, and the judgment of an entire town, who still found the strength to make dinner and speak of the future. He thought of what Sheriff Porter had said of the warnings Thomas Reed had delivered, of the dangers that still lurk beyond their temporary sanctuary. But for now, in the warmth of the cabin, with the scent of hot food and the soft sound of Sarah humming as she stirred the stew, Jackson allowed himself to set aside those concerns. For now, they were safe. For now, this small space they shared was enough. Starving, he said, and was rewarded with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time since he'd found her in the snow. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of more snow. Inside, two damaged souls shared a meal by firelight, finding in each other's company a respite from the cold that had nothing to do with winter. And somewhere in the darkness, beyond the cabin's warm glow, Thomas Reed planned his next move in a game where the stakes were higher than anyone yet realized. The days that followed took on a rhythm, a pattern of shared routines that gradually transformed Jackson's solitary existence into something approaching domestic life. Each morning he would rise before dawn, stoke the fire, and step outside to check the perimeter of the cabin, a habit born of caution rather than expectation. Each morning he found nothing but the unbroken expanse of snow and the silence of the winter hills. Inside, Sarah would be awake, sitting up in bed, with her hands resting on her swollen belly, watching him with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see more than he intended to show. They would share breakfast, usually porridge with dried fruit and coffee, speaking little but growing comfortable in each other's presence. During the days, Jackson would attend to the necessary tasks of survival, chopping wood, checking his trap lines, hunting when the weather permitted. Sarah, growing stronger by the day, took over the indoor work. Cooking, mending, keeping the cabin in an order it hadn't known since Eleanor's death. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, each lost in private thoughts, while the wind sang its lonely song outside. It was during one such evening, a week after Jackson's trip to town, that Sarah discovered the journal. Jackson had gone to check on Sergeant, making sure the horse was properly sheltered against the coming night. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots and hanging his coat by the door, he found Sarah seated in his chair by the fire, a small leather-bound book open in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mixture of curiosity and apology. "I was looking for thread," she said, gesturing toward the trunk at the foot of the bed, now standing open. "I found this instead. On my email." Jackson recognized the journal immediately, Eleanor's diary preserved, along with her few personal effects in the trunk he rarely opened. A cold weight settled in his stomach, but he kept his face carefully neutral. "It was my wife's," he said simply, crossing to the stove where coffee still simmered. He poured himself a cup, more to have something to do with his hands than from any desire for the bitter liquid. "Eleanor," Sarah said softly, tracing the name inscribed on the inside cover. "It's a beautiful name." Jackson nodded, his back still turned. She was a beautiful woman. "You read this often," Sarah observed. Not a question, but a statement, based on the journal's well-worn binding, the familiar way it lay open in her hands. "Some nights," he admitted, finally turning to face her, "when the silence gets too loud." Sarah closed the book gently, holding it out to him. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have pried." Jackson took the journal, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. "You weren't prying," he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "Not really." He returned the book to the trunk, but left the lid open, a silent permission should she wish to look again. When he straightened, Sarah was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher, thoughtful perhaps, or sad. "How did she die?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson moved to the window, staring out at the gathering darkness. The question was one he'd expected, yet it still struck like a physical blow. "Childbirth," he said finally, "her and the baby both." Sarah made a small sound, sympathy, not surprise. "I'm sorry," she said again, and he knew she meant it. It was a long time ago. 7 years, 3 months, and 14 days to be precise, but he didn't say that part aloud. "Is that why you left medicine?" He turned from the window, studying her face in the firelight. "What makes you think I left medicine?" A small smile curved her lips. "You have the hands of a surgeon, but the calluses of a man who works with wood and metal. And you keep your instruments in that chest by the door. I've seen them. But they're wrapped up tight like things you don't intend to use again." Her perception unsettled him. Few people bothered to look closely enough to see such details, especially about a man who preferred to keep to himself. "Yes," he acknowledged, "that's why I left. Couldn't save my own wife and child, didn't seem right to keep trying with others." The bitterness in his voice surprised him. He'd thought that particular wound had scarred over long ago. Sarah didn't flinch from his tone. "So you came here instead, to punish yourself with solitude." "To find peace," he corrected, though her assessment hit closer to the truth than he liked to admit. "And have you found peace?" Jackson considered the question, looking around the cabin that had been his refuge and his prison for 7 years. "Found quiet," he said finally. "It's not the same thing." Sarah nodded, accepting his answer without judgment. She rose from the chair with the careful movements of a woman carrying precious cargo, one hand braced against her lower back. Well, she said, moving toward the stove, perhaps we can find something in between quiet and peace, something that allows for a little music at least. And before he could respond, she began to sing, not Shenandoah this time, but another old tune, a lullaby he vaguely remembered from his own childhood. Her voice was clear and sweet, rising and falling, with the gentle cadence of the song filling the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Jackson stood motionless, caught between the instinct to stop her, to preserve the protective silence he'd built around himself, and the unexpected pleasure of simply listening. In the end, he did neither, but simply closed his eyes and let the music wash over him, a balm for wounds he'd stopped acknowledging long ago. When the song ended, the silence that followed seemed different somehow, not empty but full of possibility. Jackson opened his eyes to find Sarah watching him, a question in her gaze. "You have a beautiful voice," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. "Thank you." She turned back to the stove, stirring the stew that would be their dinner. "I used to sing all the time before, well before everything changed." Jackson recognized the deliberate vagueness of everything, a word that encompassed a broken marriage, a dead husband, a town's condemnation, and an unborn child who would enter the world carrying the weight of others' judgments. "You should sing more," he said, surprising himself again. "If you want to." Sarah glanced over her shoulder, a smile warming her features. "I'd like that," she said. "Very much." That night, as they ate their simple dinner, Sarah told him more about her life before Willow Gap, growing up in St. Louis, the daughter of a respected doctor, educated better than most women of her time. How she'd met Jim Bennett during a trip west with her father, who was attending a medical conference in Denver. "He was charming then," she said, her eyes distant with memory. "Handsome, confident, said all the right things. My father didn't approve, thought Jim was too rough around the edges for his educated daughter. But I was young and thought I knew better." She described their wedding, the move to Willow Gap, where the Bennett name meant something, the gradual revelation of Jim's true nature as his drinking worsened, and his bitterness over the Confederacy's defeat poisoned whatever gentleness he might once have possessed. "The war changed many men," Jackson observed, thinking of the broken soldiers he'd treated, not just their physical wounds, but the deeper damage that no surgery could repair. "Yes," Sarah agreed, "though I sometimes wonder if it just revealed what was already there waiting for permission to emerge." They fell silent then, each contemplating the ways conflict transformed those who survived it. Jackson thought of his own changes, the nightmares, the instinctive recoil from loud noises, the way he sometimes woke in the night convinced he was back in a field hospital, hands deep in another man's blood. "Why did you join up?" Sarah asked, as if reading his thoughts. "As a doctor, you could have stayed behind, treated the wounded after they came back." Jackson set down his empty bowl, considering the question. "My father was a surgeon before he said finally. Taught me everything he knew. When the war came, he was too old to serve, but he said someone from our family should be there, that it was our duty to use our skills where they were most needed. And that was on the battlefield." "That's where the dying was happening," Jackson said simply. "Seemed like the place for a doctor to be." Sarah studied him across the table, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. "You're a good man, Jackson Miles," she said softly. "Whatever you might think of yourself." He looked away, uncomfortable with her assessment. "I'm just a man," he said. "No better or worse than most." "You saved my life," she reminded him, "and my child's, when it would have been easier to ride on by. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said with quiet certainty. "They wouldn't. The whole town of Willow Gap proved that." Before he could respond, Scout raised his head from where he'd been dozing by the fire, ears pricked forward. A low growl rumbled in the old dog's throat. Jackson was on his feet instantly, reaching for the rifle that leaned against the wall by the door. "Stay here," he told Sarah, moving to the window with the silent tread of a man accustomed to hunting. Outside, the night was clear. Stars scattered across the black velvet sky, the snow reflecting their faint light. At first, Jackson saw nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of his clearing, the dark line of trees beyond. Then a movement caught his eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness of the forest. Scout growled again, louder this time. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with tension. "Someone's out there," Jackson replied, keeping his voice low. "Just one from what I can see." He watched as the figure moved cautiously across the open ground, keeping close to the tree line. Too small to be Thomas Reed, he thought, and lacking the purposeful stride of the wealthy rancher. This was someone more hesitant, more wary. When the figure was about 30 yards from the cabin, it stopped, standing motionless in the starlight. Then, after a moment's pause, it raised one hand in what appeared to be a greeting or perhaps a request. "Stay inside," Jackson said, decision made. He grabbed his coat from its peg, checked that his pistol was secure in its holster, and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The sharp crack of a rifle shot split the silence. Jackson dropped instinctively, hitting the porch floor as splinters flew from the doorframe where his head had been a moment before. Scout barked furiously from inside the cabin, and he heard Sarah's startled cry. "Stay down," he shouted to her, crawling to the edge of the porch where he could peer around the corner. The figure he'd spotted was now running not toward the cabin, but away back toward the shelter of the trees. From a different direction, the south ridge, Jackson guessed another shot rang out, kicking up snow near the fleeing figure's feet. An ambush, then. But who was the target, him or the mysterious visitor? Jackson didn't have time to puzzle it out. He raised his rifle sighting along the barrel toward the ridge where the shot had originated. He couldn't see the shooter, but he sent a warning shot in that direction anyway, the report echoing off the surrounding hills. The night fell silent again, save for Scout's continued barking and the pounding of Jackson's heart in his ears. He waited, counting seconds, watching for any movement. Nothing. Whoever had fired those shots had either withdrawn or was lying in wait, hidden among the rocks and trees of the ridge. The other figure had disappeared as well, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. Friend or foe, they were gone now. Slowly, cautiously, Jackson rose to a crouch and backed toward the cabin door, keeping his rifle trained on the ridge. Only when he was safely inside, door barred behind him, did he allow himself to exhale. Sarah stood in the center of the room, her face pale in the lamplight, one hand clutching the back of a chair for support, the other resting protectively on her belly. "Are you hurt?" she asked, eyes scanning him for injuries. Jackson shook his head. "They missed, or meant to miss. Hard to say." Sarah's voice rose slightly. "There was more than one." "Someone on the ridge," he explained, moving to check that all the shutters were secured, shooting at someone else who was approaching the cabin. "Thomas?" Sarah whispered, fear evident in her voice. Maybe, Jackson conceded, though something about the scenario didn't fit with what he knew of Reed. But why shoot at his own man? And who was the other person? Sarah sank into the chair, her brief strength exhausted by the surge of fear. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'm afraid we'll find out soon enough." Jackson couldn't disagree. Whatever game was being played, they were at its center, and the rules were becoming more dangerous by the day. "We should leave," Sarah said, suddenly looking up at him with determination, replacing fear in her eyes. "Tomorrow. Go somewhere Thomas can't find us." "Where?" Jackson asked, though the idea had merit. "In your condition, we couldn't travel far or fast. And winter's no time to be on the road with a baby coming." "Then after," she insisted. "After the baby comes. We'll go west maybe, or north into Canada, somewhere new where no one knows us or cares about the Bennett name." The presumption in her words that they would go together, that their fates were now somehow linked beyond this temporary arrangement, should have alarmed him. Instead, Jackson found himself considering the possibility with a seriousness that surprised him. "We'll see," he said, noncommittal, but not dismissive. "For now, we should get some rest. I'll keep watch for a while." Sarah looked as if she wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was evident in the slump of her shoulders, the shadows beneath her eyes. She nodded, rising with that careful, deliberate movement of the heavily pregnant. "Wake me in a few hours," she said. "You need rest too." Jackson agreed, though he had no intention of sleeping that night. As Sarah prepared for bed, he settled into the chair by the window, rifle across his knees, gaze fixed on the dark landscape beyond the glass. Who had been out there? And what did they want? The questions circled in his mind like wary predators, offering no answers but plenty of cause for concern. One thing was certain, their peaceful interlude was over. Whatever storm had been brewing since he found Sarah in the snow was about to break, and they would need all their strength to weather it. Morning dawned clear and cold, the sun rising to cast long blue shadows across the unmarked snow surrounding the cabin. No tracks remained from the previous night's visitors. A light snowfall in the pre-dawn hours had covered whatever evidence might have been left behind. Jackson, who had maintained his vigil through the night despite Sarah's protests, watched the sunrise with gritty eyes and a sense of foreboding that coffee couldn't dispel. Something had changed. The isolation that had once been his refuge now felt like vulnerability, the remote location of his cabin less a blessing than a liability. Sarah moved quietly about the morning routine, preparing breakfast with the efficiency she brought to all household tasks. She hadn't mentioned there were midnight visitors again, nor her suggestion that they flee once the baby was born. But Jackson caught her glancing frequently toward the window, her gaze scanning the tree line with the wariness of prey sensing predators. "I need to go back to town," he said as they finished their meal. Sarah looked up sharply. "After last night, it's too dangerous." "Because of last night," he corrected. "We need information, need to know what we're facing." She couldn't argue with the logic, but worry creased her brow. "Thomas will be watching for you." "Counting on it," Jackson said grimly. Better to face him on his ground where he has to maintain appearances than wait for him to come to us again in the dark. And if he doesn't care about appearances anymore, Jackson checked his pistol, ensuring it was loaded and ready. Then we'll know exactly where we stand. He left within the hour, instructing Sarah to bar the door behind him and keep the rifle close. Scout would stay with her. The old dog's hearing was keener than any alarm, and his loyalty beyond question. The ride to Willow Gap was tense, Jackson scanning the trail constantly for signs of ambush or pursuit. But he encountered no one, the winter landscape empty of human presence, save for the occasional wisp of smoke rising from a distant chimney. The town seemed subdued as he rode in the main street, nearly deserted, despite the clear weather. A few faces appeared in windows as he passed, quickly withdrawing when he glanced their way. Something had happened, something that had the townsfolk on edge. Jackson tied Sergeant at the hitching post outside the sheriff's office, patting the horse's neck reassuringly before mounting the steps to the weathered building. Inside, a pot-bellied stove radiated welcome heat, and the smell of coffee and tobacco hung in the air. Sheriff Porter looked up from his desk, surprise registering briefly before his features settled into their customary weariness. "Miles," he acknowledged. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." "Had some excitement at my place last night," Jackson said without preamble. "Thought you might know something about it." Porter's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Awareness, perhaps, or concern. What kind of excitement? The kind that involves rifles after dark. Jackson remained standing, hat in hand, watching the lawman carefully. "Someone took a shot at me, and at someone else who was approaching my cabin." Now Porter did react, sitting up straighter, his brow furrowing. "Anyone hurt?" "No, but not for lack of training." Porter sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Sit down, Miles. Coffee." Jackson accepted the offer, taking the chair opposite Porter's desk and the tin cup of strong black coffee the sheriff poured from a pot on the stove. He waited while Porter settled back into his own seat, sensing the man had information to share, but was considering how much to reveal. "There was trouble here in town yesterday," Porter said finally. "At the saloon, a stranger came in, started asking questions about Jim Bennett's death, about his widow." Jackson kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. "What kind of questions?" "Specific ones, about the night Jim died. Who was there? Who did what?" Porter took a sip of his own coffee, watching Jackson over the rim of the cup. "Kind of questions a man doesn't ask unless he already knows some of the answers. And that caused trouble." Porter's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. "In Willow Gap, a stranger asking about the Bennett family? Yeah, that caused trouble." He set his cup down with a small click. "Thomas Reed got wind of it, came down to the saloon himself. There were words exchanged, then fists." "The stranger got the worst of it, I imagine," Jackson said, thinking of Reed's imposing build and the influence he wielded in town. "Actually, no." Porter's expression held something close to admiration. "Stranger held his own, military man by the look of him, knew how to handle himself in a fight." Jackson absorbed this information, turning it over in his mind. A stranger asking about Jim Bennett's death and Sarah's connection to it. A man with military training capable of standing against Thomas Reed. Could this be the same figure that he'd glimpsed outside his cabin? "Did this stranger give a name?" he asked. Porter shook his head. "None that I heard. He cleared out after the fight, or was convinced to clear out. Thought that was the end of it until you showed up talking about rifle shots in the night." "You think Reed followed him?" Jackson said, pieces beginning to fall into place. "Followed him to my cabin." "It's possible," Porter allowed. "Reed's been unstable since Sarah Bennett disappeared. More so since word got back that she was staying with you." He leaned forward, lowering his voice, though they were alone in the office. "There's something you should know, Miles, about the night Jim Bennett died." Jackson waited, Eddie sensing they were approaching the heart of the matter. The man who killed Jim, the one who stepped in when things got ugly at the saloon, he wasn't just passing through like Sarah claimed. Porter's gaze was steady, measuring Jackson's reaction. He was looking for her. Had been for weeks, asking questions all over the territory. "Who was he?" Jackson asked, though a cold certainty was already forming in his gut. "A musician, from what folks said. Fiddle player. Traveled with a small troupe before the war, then served in the Union Army. Came back west after playing for his supper in saloons and dance halls." Porter paused, letting the information sink in. Sarah knew him before she ever met Jim Bennett. The implication was clear, and it aligned with the whispers Thomas Reed had mentioned that the child Sarah carried might not be her dead husband's after all. "Does Reed know this about the musician?" Porter spread his hands in a gesture of uncertainty. "Hard to say what Thomas knows or doesn't know. He was desperate to find the man after Jim's death, posted rewards, hired trackers. But the trail went cold. Man vanished like he'd never been. Until yesterday, Jackson said grimly. Until yesterday, Porter agreed. And now someone's taking shots in the night, and you're in the middle of it. He studied Jackson with a shrewd gaze. You sure this is your fight, Miles? You've kept to yourself a long time. Why get mixed up in Bennett family business now? It was a fair question, one Jackson had asked himself in the quiet hours of his nighttime vigil. Why risk the peace he carved out for himself? Why stand against a man as powerful and determined as Thomas Reed? Why involve himself in Sarah Bennett's complicated past? She needed help, he said simply. Still does. Porter nodded slowly as if confirming something to himself. Thought it might be like that. He sighed, draining the last of his coffee. Well, since you're determined to be in this, you should know Reed's been making official noises, talking about the welfare of the child, about Sarah's fitness as a mother given the circumstances of the father. The child isn't even born yet, Jackson pointed out, anger stirring beneath his calm exterior. Doesn't matter to Reed or to Judge Wilson, who owes the Bennett family for his position. Porter's expression was grave. Once that baby arrives, Reed will make his move, legal-like with the court's backing. And in a place like Willow Gap with the Bennett name behind him, he'll get what he wants. Unless we're not here, Jackson said, giving voice to Sarah's suggestion from the previous night. Porter raised an eyebrow. Running's an option, he acknowledged, but Reed's reach is long in these parts. And a woman near her time in winter. He left the sentence unfinished, the dangers obvious to both men. Jackson stood, having heard enough to confirm his suspicions and deepen his concerns. Thanks for the coffee, Sheriff, and the information. Porter rose as well, extending a hand which Jackson shook briefly. Be careful, Miles. Reed's not a man who loses gracefully, and he's got a lot more riding on this than you might realize. What do you mean? Porter hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. The Bennett fortune, the mill, the businesses, the land, it's all tied up in the family line. Jim was the direct heir, but with him gone, Thomas inherited. With conditions. What kind of conditions? The kind old man Bennett put in his will to ensure the family name continued. If there's a legitimate child of Jim's, that child becomes the primary heir when they come of age. Thomas would be steward until then, but the bulk of the fortune would eventually pass to Jim's offspring. And if there is no legitimate child, Jackson asked, though he already knew the answer, then Thomas keeps it all, Porter confirmed, which makes the question of who fathered Sarah's baby very important indeed. If it's not Jim's child, then it has no claim on the Bennett fortune, Jackson finished, and Reed's position is secure. Exactly, Porter's expression was grim. So you see, this isn't just about family honor or town morality. For Thomas Reed, this is about money and power. And men have killed for far less. The warning hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Jackson nodded, settling his hat back on his head. One more thing, Porter said as Jackson reached for the door. My daughter Abigail. The town's been hard on her, two different circumstances, but the same judgment, same whispers. His voice held a father's pain roller than Jackson would have expected from the weathered lawman. Not everyone deserves the labels this town puts on them. It was as close to an explicit statement of support as Porter could give while maintaining his official neutrality. Jackson acknowledged it with a slight nod. I'll keep that in mind, Sheriff. Outside, the day had warmed slightly, the sun doing its best against the winter chill. Jackson stood on the boardwalk for a moment, considering his next move. He needed supplies. The midnight visitors had reminded him of the precariousness of their situation, and he wanted to be prepared for a quick departure if necessary. As he turned toward the general store, a movement across the street caught his eye. A man stood in the shadowed alley between the gunsmith shop and the land office, watching him with an intensity that set Jackson's instincts on alert. Not Thomas Reed, but a stranger, lean and weathered, with the self-contained stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. Their eyes met across the distance, a moment of recognition, though Jackson was certain they had never encountered each other before. The stranger nodded once, a deliberate acknowledgement, then turned and disappeared into the alley's deeper shadows. Jackson hesitated, torn between following the man and completing his errands. Curiosity warred with caution, but in the end, practicality won. Whatever game was being played, he and Sarah needed to be ready for its next move. That meant supplies, ammunition, and a swift return to the cabin where she waited vulnerable and alone. The general store was empty, save for Harold Parker, who greeted Jackson with the same wary neutrality as before. If the storekeeper was aware of the previous day's altercation at the saloon, he gave no sign of it as he filled Jackson's orders for coffee, flour, salt, and ammunition. Weather's turning, Parker commented as he wrapped the goods in brown paper. Another storm coming from the look of the sky to the west. Jackson glanced out the window, noting the bank of dark clouds gathering on the horizon. How soon? Tonight, probably. Tomorrow morning at the latest. Parker tied the packages with string, his movements efficient despite his apparent disinterest. Big one by the signs. Might want to stay in town if you've got far to go. The suggestion, innocuous on its surface, carried an undercurrent that Jackson didn't miss. Stay in town where Reed could find him easily, where Sarah would be alone at the cabin. Appreciate the concern, he said dryly, but I've weathered plenty of storms in these hills. Parker shrugged, accepting payment for the goods. Suit yourself. Just thought I'd mention it being the Christian thing to do. Jackson gathered his purchases and stepped back onto the boardwalk, immediately aware of being watched. Not by the mysterious stranger this time, but by faces in windows, figures pausing in their errands to observe him with barely concealed curiosity and suspicion. Word had spread about his connection to Sarah Bennett, it seemed. In a town the size of Willow Gap, gossip traveled faster than winter storms. He loaded his supplies onto Sergeant, checking the cinch and bridle with the careful attention of a man who knew his life might depend on his horse. As he worked, he maintained awareness of his surroundings, noting who passed by, who lingered, who hurried away at the sight of him. One figure in particular caught his attention, a young woman standing outside the milliner's shop, her posture straight despite the obvious swell of her belly beneath her coat. She was perhaps 20, with a pretty face shadowed by unhappiness, and she was watching him with an expression that held neither curiosity nor condemnation, but something closer to hope. As their eyes met, she took a hesitant step forward, then stopped as an older woman emerged from the shop and took her arm, steering her away with a sharp glance in Jackson's direction. Abigail Porter, he realized. The sheriff's daughter, bearing her own burden of town judgment, her own shame carried beneath her heart. Something in her gaze, the mix of defiance and despair, the silent plea for understanding, reminded him so strongly of Sarah that his chest ached. How many women carried such burdens? How many faced the harsh judgment of communities that forgave men their transgressions while condemning women for the same or less? The questions followed him as he mounted Sergeant and turned the horse toward home, toward Sarah and the uncertain future that awaited them both. The gathering storm clouds to the west matched his mood, dark, heavy with potential violence, and moving inexorably closer. Sarah was waiting on the porch when he rode into the clearing, Scout at her side. Relief washed over her face at the sight of him, quickly masked but unmistakable. She had been worried, perhaps had even doubted he would return at all. "Storm's coming," she said by way of greeting, helping him unload the supplies from Sergeant's back. "Parker mentioned it," Jackson replied, leading the horse to the small stable behind the cabin. "Should hit tonight or tomorrow." Sarah followed him, carrying the lighter packages while he managed the heavier sacks of flour and coffee. "Did you learn anything in town?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Jackson waited until they were inside, doors secured behind them, before answering. "Yes," he said simply, "but you're not going to like it." He told her everything, the stranger asking questions about Jim's death, the fight with Reed, Sheriff Porter's revelations about the Bennett will, and the financial implications of her child's parentage. Throughout his recounting, Sarah's expression remained composed, though her hands resting on her belly betrayed her tension with their white-knuckled grip. "So now we know why Thomas is so determined," she said when he finished. "It's not about family honor. It's about money. Family, money, power, they're all tied together for men like Reed," Jackson observed, stoking the fire against the growing chill. "But yes, the financial angle explains his persistence." Sarah moved to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "And the stranger, the one who came to town asking questions?" Jackson hesitated, unsure how much to reveal of Porter's other information about the musician who had known Sarah before Jim, who might be the father of her child. But honesty seemed the only path forward in their increasingly precarious situation. "Porter said he was a musician, a fiddle player who knew you before you met Jim Bennett." Sarah's back stiffened, but she didn't turn from the window. "Did Porter say his name?" "No, just that he'd been looking for you after Jim's death. That he was the one who—" Jackson paused, choosing his words carefully. "Who intervened the night Jim died." Now she did turn, her face pale but composed. "His name is David Calloway," she said quietly. "And yes, I knew him before I met Jim. We were, close." The admission hung in the air between them, neither accusation nor defense, simply a fact finally spoken aloud. "Is he the father of your child?" Jackson asked the question direct, but his tone gentle. Sarah's hand moved to her belly in that instinctive, protective gesture he had come to recognize. "Yes," she whispered the word barely audible above the crackling of the fire. "David is the father." Jackson nodded, accepting the truth without judgment. It confirmed what he had already suspected, what the town of Willow Gap had whispered behind closed doors. "We were in love," Sarah continued, her voice stronger now, as if the admission had released something held too long in check. "Before the war, David traveled with a musical troupe, and they performed in St. Louis where my father practiced medicine. We met at a social gathering, and she smiled faintly at the memory. He played the fiddle like his soul was in every note. I'd never heard anything like it. She moved from the window to the table, running her fingers over the smooth wood surface as she spoke. We were young, foolish, my father would have said. We talked of marriage, of traveling together, of the life we would build. Then the war came and David joined the Union Army. He promised to come back for me. But he didn't, Jackson guessed, filling in the obvious gap in her narrative. He tried, Sarah corrected. He wrote letters, beautiful letters that I treasured. But my father intercepted most of them. He'd never approved of David, a traveling musician with no formal education, no prospects beyond his talent. When David finally returned to St. Louis after the war, my father told him I had married another man and moved west. But you hadn't, Jackson said, beginning to understand the tangled web of deception and misunderstanding that had led them all to this point. Not then, no, but my father arranged it soon after introduced me to Jim Bennett, who was in St. Louis on business. Jim was everything my father wanted for me, educated from a good family with a promising future managing his father's businesses in Willow Gap. Sarah's voice held no bitterness, only a resigned acceptance of paths taken and choices made. I agreed to the marriage believing David had abandoned his promises to me, and perhaps seeking some escape from my father's house, which had become difficult after my mother's death. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling around the eaves of the cabin, with a mournful sound that complemented Sarah's tale of loss and separation. When did you discover the truth? Jackson asked. About the letters about David trying to find you. 2 years ago, Sarah said, her gaze meeting his with unflinching directness. David came to Willow Gap tracking rumors that led him to me. By then, my marriage to Jim was... She hesitated, searching for the right word. Unbearable, she finally said. Jim drank too much, blamed everyone, the Yankees, his father, me, for his failures. He'd lost most of the Bennett fortune on bad investments and gambling, and his temper grew worse with each loss. Jackson could fill in the blanks of what worse entailed. He'd seen the signs in her reactions, in her instinctive flinch at sudden movements and the warinesses that never quite left her eyes. David found me singing at the White Stag, Sarah continued. He came in one night, and there I was on the small stage singing the old songs we'd both loved. He said later it was like seeing a ghost, the girl he'd searched for across half the country suddenly before him. And you recognized him? Jackson said, not a question, but a statement. Sarah nodded, a smile touching her lips, despite the gravity of her story. Immediately, he'd changed, we both had, but I would know him anywhere. Her smile faded. We spoke briefly that night, arranged to meet again. In secret. It was dangerous. Jim's jealousy was unpredictable, but I had to know why David hadn't come for me, why he'd abandoned his promises. And he told you about the letters, about your father's deception. Yes. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, the pain of that revelation still evident in her expression. Everything I'd believed for years, all the hurt, the sense of betrayal it was built on, lies. David had been faithful. He had tried to find me, and I had given up on him too easily, had allowed my father to guide me into a marriage that brought nothing but pain. Jackson remained silent, allowing her to tell the story at her own pace in her own way. This was a confession long in coming. He sensed perhaps the first time she had spoken the full truth aloud. We met in secret for weeks, she continued, just to talk at first, to reconnect, to understand what had happened to each of us in the years apart. But she looked down at her hands, then back up at Jackson, her gaze steady despite the vulnerability of her confession. We still loved each other, despite everything, despite the years and changes that hadn't died. And you became lovers again. Jackson said the words, neither accusation nor judgment. Yes. No apology in her voice, no shame, just the simple acknowledgement of a truth too long hidden. For a brief time, I remembered what it was to be happy, to be cherished rather than possessed, to be seen as something more than a possession or disappointment. Until the night Jim died, Jackson prompted gently. Sarah nodded, her expression darkening with the memory. Jim had been drinking more heavily than usual. The mill had failed, his last significant investment gone. He came to the saloon that night in a black rage, determined to blame someone for his misfortunes. When he saw me on stage singing, she shook her head. Something in him broke. He started shouting, calling me terrible names, accusing me of exactly what I had been doing, though he had no proof. She took a deep breath, steadying herself against the painful recollection. Malas Holloway tried to intervene to calm Jim down. Jim struck him, knocked the poor man to the floor. And then David stepped in. He hadn't planned to be there that night, but he'd come to tell me he'd found work in Denver, that he wanted me to leave with him, to start over somewhere Jim couldn't find us. The pieces were falling into place now, the jealous husband, the secret lover, the public confrontation that ended in violence. A story as old as humanity itself played out in a frontier town with a Bennett name and fortune raising the stakes to deadly levels. There was a scuffle. Sarah continued, her voice distant now, as if she were watching the scene unfold again before her eyes. Jim pulled a knife. He always carried one, especially when drinking. He lunged at David, but he was too drunk to be effective. David defended himself. They struggled, and then she closed her eyes. The knife was in Jim's chest. David looked as shocked as everyone else. It happened so fast, so chaotically, that I'm not sure anyone could say exactly how it ended that way. Self-defense, Jackson said, the legal term inadequate for the human tragedy it described. Yes, though it hardly mattered in that moment. Jim was dying on the saloon floor, and everyone was looking at me, at David, as if we'd planned it together. Sarah opened her eyes, meeting Jackson's gaze directly. We hadn't. Despite everything Jim had done, I never wished him dead. Neither did David. What happened then? Chaos, people shouting, someone running for the doctor, though it was already too late. David managed to slip away in the confusion. He knew how it would look, knew the Bennett name would ensure he never received a fair hearing. Sarah's hand moved to her belly, as it so often did when she spoke of difficult things. I didn't know then that I was carrying his child. We had been careful, but life finds a way, Jackson finished, thinking of the many unexpected pregnancies he'd encountered during his medical career. Sarah smiled faintly at his phrasing. Yes, it does. The smile faded. When I realized weeks later, I knew I had to keep it secret as long as possible. If anyone suspected the child wasn't Jim's, especially Thomas, who had already been watching me with suspicion since Jim's death, I would be in danger. The baby would be in danger. So you claimed it was Jim's, Jackson said, understanding her desperate strategy, conceived before his death. Yes, it was plausible if barely, but as I grew larger, as the timing became more difficult to dismiss, the whisper started. Thomas began asking questions, investigating. And then she gestured around the cabin at the situation they now found themselves in. Well, you know the rest. Jackson considered all she had told him, fitting this new information into the complex puzzle of Sarah Bennett's life and the circumstances that had brought her to his door. One question remained gnawing at him with increasing urgency. The man outside our cabin last night, he said, the one being shot at, could it have been David? Sarah's face paled, the possibility clearly having occurred to her as well. I don't know, she whispered. I haven't seen or heard from him since that night at the saloon. I assumed he'd fled the territory, gone somewhere. Thomas couldn't find him. But if he came back, Jackson pressed, if he learned you were still alive, that you were carrying his child, he would try to find me. Sarah acknowledged, her voice barely audible above the rising wind outside. He would risk everything to reach me. The implications hung between them, heavy with potential consequences. If David Calloway had indeed returned to Willow Gap, if he had tracked Sarah to Jackson's cabin, then the stakes of their situation had risen dramatically. It was no longer just about Sarah and her unborn child, but about a man who had killed once already in self-defense, but killed nonetheless, and who might be desperate enough to do so again. If it was David, Sarah said, breaking the silence that had fallen, if he's here, then Thomas won't rest until he finds him, until he finds us. Her eyes met Jackson's, fear and determination warring in their storm-gray depths. We're in more danger than ever. Jackson couldn't disagree. The web of past actions and present consequences was drawing tighter around them all, a noose that threatened to strangle whatever future they might hope to build. Outside, the first heavy flakes of snow began to fall, harbingers of the storm Parker had predicted. Soon the world would be wrapped in white silence, the trails impassable, the cabin isolated more completely than ever before. But isolation, Jackson knew, was no longer protection. Not when Thomas Reed's determination was fueled by financial desperation as well as family pride. Not when David Calloway might be nearby, driven by love and guilt, and the knowledge that his child would soon enter a world ready to condemn it from its first breath. What do we do? Sarah asked, her hand instinctively cradling the life within her. Jackson moved to the window, watching the snow fall with increasing intensity, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. We prepare, he said simply, for whatever comes next. Whether that was birth or battle or both, he didn't say. But as the storm enveloped the cabin in its cold embrace, Jackson Miles felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. He had made a choice the day he found Sarah in the snow, a choice that had set him on a path he could no longer abandon, no matter what dangers it held. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, two men, one driven by greed, one by love, were making their own choices, drawing ever closer to a confrontation that would determine all their fates. The storm had arrived, in more ways than one. The storm arrived with nightfall transforming from scattered flakes to a howling fury that bent pine trees and buried the cabin beneath a thickening blanket of white. Wind screamed through every tiny gap in the logs, seeking entrance like a hungry predator. Inside, Jackson had built a fire, high-stocking it with enough wood to last through the night. Lamps burned against the darkness, casting warm pools of light that pushed back the shadows but couldn't dispel the tension that hung in the air. Sarah moved restlessly about the cabin, one hand supporting her lower back, the other occasionally pressing against the swell of her belly. She had been quiet since her confession about David Calloway, as if the unburdening of her secret had exhausted her capacity for conversation. Now she paused by the window, peering out at the swirling snow that rendered the world beyond the glass invisible. "No one will travel in this," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind's mournful howl. Jackson looked up from the rifle he was cleaning, a task born more of habit than necessity. "That cuts both ways," he reminded her. "We're safe from Reed for now. But if trouble comes—" He left the implication unspoken. Sarah nodded, understanding his meaning. In weather like this, they were on their own. No possibility of help, no escape route, no margin for error. She winced suddenly, her hand tightening on her belly. "What is it?" Jackson asked, setting aside the rifle and rising to his feet. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just the baby moving. She's been restless all day." Jackson studied her face, noting the tension around her eyes, the slight pallor beneath her usually warm complexion. "Are you sure?" Sarah attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Dr. Miles again. Old habits," he admitted, moving closer. "But you'd tell me if something was wrong." "Of course, forgotten." She turned back to the window, effectively ending the conversation. "How long do you think the storm will last?" Jackson accepted the change of subject, though his concern remained. "Hard to say. A day, maybe two. Parker thought it would be a big one from the signs. And after that, the trails will be impassable for a while. Too much snow for easy travel." "Good," Sarah said with a vehemence that surprised him. "Let Thomas Reed sit in Willow Gap and stew in his own schemes. The longer he can't reach us, the better." Jackson couldn't disagree, though he knew the reprieve would be temporary at best. The storm might delay Reed's plans, but it wouldn't change them. Nor would it resolve the question of David Calloway's presence in the territory or the danger his return represented. "We should discuss what happens after," he said, voicing the thought that had been circling in his mind since their conversation that afternoon. Sarah turned from the window, her expression guarded. After the baby comes." Jackson gestured to her swollen belly. "It won't be long now, a few weeks at most by my estimate." She nodded, one hand moving instinctively to cradle her unborn child. "No, not long." A shadow passed across her face, fear perhaps, or uncertainty. "I haven't let myself think too far ahead. It seemed dangerous to make plans that might never come to pass." Jackson understood her caution. Life was fragile in the best of circumstances. In their current situation, with threats converging from multiple directions, planning for the future felt like tempting fate. But plans had to be made, decisions taken if they were to have any hope of surviving what was coming. "You mentioned going west," he said, "or north to Canada after the birth." Sarah studied him, her gaze searching his face as if looking for something hidden beneath his words. "Yes," she said cautiously. "Somewhere Thomas can't find us. Somewhere the Bennett name means nothing." "It's a good plan," Jackson acknowledged, "but difficult in winter with a newborn." "We'd wait for spring," she said, her use of "we" delivered a question disguised as a statement. Jackson let the implication hang between them, neither confirming nor denying the assumption that they would travel together, that their futures were somehow linked beyond the immediate crisis. It was a question he wasn't ready to answer, not because he didn't know his own mind, but because the answer carried implications he wasn't sure Sarah had fully considered. "Spring would be safer," he agreed, sidestepping the larger issue. "But Reed won't wait that long. Once the snow clears enough for travel, he'll make his move." "Then we leave before he can," Sarah said, a note of desperation entering her voice. "As soon as the baby and I are strong enough. We don't wait for him to come to us." "And David?" Jackson asked, the name falling between them like a stone in still water, ripples of complications spreading outward. "If he's here, if he was the one outside our cabin that night, what then?" Sarah's expression softened at the mention of her former lover, a mixture of hope and pain that told Jackson more than her words had about the depth of her feelings for the musician. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never expected to see him again after that night at the saloon. Never thought he'd come back knowing the danger." "But he has," Jackson said, certain now that the figure he'd glimpsed had indeed been David Calloway. "For you, for his child." Sarah looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Yes," she whispered, "and that changes everything, doesn't it?" The question hung in the air, loaded with meanings neither of them was ready to articulate. Jackson had known intellectually that David's return would alter their tentative plans, their unspoken understandings. But the reality of it, the emotional implications, the choices it would force, struck him with unexpected force. Before he could respond, Scout raised his head from where he'd been dozing by the fire, ears pricked forward in sudden alertness. A low growl rumbled in the old dog's throat. Jackson reached for his rifle, movement smooth with practiced ease. "Stay away from the windows," he told Sarah, his voice low and urgent. She obeyed without question, moving to the center of the room, one hand resting on Scout's head to quiet the dog's growing agitation. Jackson approached the window cautiously, keeping to the side where he wouldn't be silhouetted against the lamplight. The storm raged, unabated snow swirling in the darkness like restless ghosts. At first, he saw nothing beyond the expected fury of the blizzard. Then a flicker of movement, something darker than the surrounding night, moving with purpose rather than being driven by the wind. A figure hunched against the storm, approaching the cabin with deliberate steps. Just one, as far as Jackson could tell. Not Reed, then, who would never travel alone. Not in this weather, not on this errand, which left only one likely possibility. "Someone's coming," he told Sarah, his voice tight with tension. Just one person. Her sharp intake of breath told him she'd reached the same conclusion he had. "David," she whispered the name, half question, half prayer. "Possibly," Jackson conceded. "Can't see clearly in this weather." "Let him in," Sarah urged, moving toward the door with a sudden urgency that surprised him. "If it's David, he'll freeze out there." Jackson hesitated, weighing the risks. If it was indeed David Calloway approaching their cabin, then the man who had killed Jim Bennett, justifiably or not, would soon be under their roof. The complications that would create, the dangers it would invite, were considerable. But Sarah was right. No one would survive long in this storm. And if the man outside was David, father of Sarah's unborn child, then denying him shelter would be a death sentence as surely as if Jackson had pulled the trigger himself. "Stay back," he instructed Sarah, moving to the door with his rifle still in hand, "until we're sure who it is." She nodded, though the eagerness in her expression, the hope that had kindled at the possibility of seeing David again, sent a pang through Jackson that he refused to examine too closely. He unbarred the door, bracing himself against the expected rush of wind and snow. The storm didn't disappoint, surging into the cabin, with Arctic fury extinguishing the nearest lamp and sending papers fluttering from the table. Through the white maelstrom, Jackson could make out a dark figure just beyond the porch, staggering forward with the last strength of a man pushed beyond endurance. Inside, Jackson shouted above the wind's howl, gesturing with his free hand while keeping the rifle ready in the other. The figure lurched forward, mounting the porch steps with clumsy haste. As he came into the light spilling from the doorway, Jackson got his first clear look at their midnight visitor. A man of medium height and wiry build, with dark hair plastered to his head by snow and ice. His clothes were inadequate for the weather, a thin coat crusted with ice boots that had clearly seen better days. But it was his face that caught and held Jackson's attention, a face marked by hardship and exhaustion, yet still handsome in a way that spoke of character, rather than conventional good looks. His eyes, dark and intense, moved past Jackson to fix on someone within the cabin. "Sarah!" He breathed the name barely audible above the storm's rage. Behind Jackson, Sarah made a small sound, half sob, half exclamation. "David," she whispered, confirming what Jackson had already guessed. David Calloway, musician, Union veteran, Sarah's former lover, and the father of her unborn child. The man who had killed Jim Bennett and fled into the night, leaving Sarah to face the consequences alone. Now he stood on Jackson's porch, half frozen and desperate eyes fixed on the woman he had traveled so far to find. Jackson stepped aside, a silent invitation that David accepted with a stumbling gratitude. As the man crossed the threshold, Sarah moved forward, caution forgotten in the shock of reunion. "You're alive," she said, reaching out but stopping just short of touching him, as if afraid he might disappear like a mirage. "I thought I feared. I never stopped looking for you." David said, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "When I heard what the town had done, that you were missing, perhaps dead." He swayed on his feet, the last of his strength ebbing now that he had reached his goal. Jackson closed the door against the storm, securing the bar, with a decisive movement that seemed to break the spell of the moment. He set the rifle aside. David Calloway was in no condition to pose a threat to anyone, and moved to assist the man who was clearly on the verge of collapse. "He needs warmth," Jackson told Sarah, practicality overriding the complex emotions of the reunion. "And dry clothes. He's half frozen." Sarah nodded, pulling herself together with visible effort. "The fire," she said. "Get him closer to the fire." Together they helped David to the hearth, where the blazing fire offered immediate relief from the bone-deep cold he carried. Jackson stripped off the man's ice-crusted coat and sodden boots, while Sarah brought blankets from the bed. Their movements were efficient, focused on the immediate needs, setting aside the larger questions that David's arrival had raised. The thank you, David managed through chattering teeth huddled in the blanket Sarah had wrapped around him. I wasn't sure I'd find you in this storm. How did you know where to look? Jackson asked the question practical rather than accusatory. David's gaze shifted from Sarah to Jackson, assessing him with the wariness of a man who had learned to trust cautiously. Sheriff Porter, he said finally. Not directly, he wouldn't break confidence, but he let enough slip that I could piece it together. A cabin in the northern hills, a man named Miles. Jackson nodded, not surprised. Porter had walked a fine line between his official duties and his personal sympathies, providing information without explicitly betraying trust. You were here before, he said. 2 nights ago. David's expression confirmed the guess. Yes, but someone was watching the cabin. When I approached, they fired. His gaze returned to Sarah, softening with concern. I couldn't risk leading them to you, so I withdrew. Waited for another chance. Reed's men, Sarah said, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. Thomas must have had the cabin watched after his visit to town. He did, David confirmed, but the storm. He gestured toward the window where snow continued to swirl in the darkness. Even Reed's hired guns won't stay out in this. It was my only chance to reach you safely. The practical assessment told Jackson more about David Calloway than any words could have. This was a man who thought strategically, who calculated risks and opportunities, who had survived hardship through wit as much as endurance. In another context, Jackson might have admired these qualities. Now they simply confirmed that David was a formidable addition to their already complicated situation. How did you find us in this? Sarah asked, gesturing toward the window and the blizzard beyond. You could have gotten lost frozen. A ghost of a smile touched David's pale lips. I've navigated by stars and sound for most of my life, he said. Even in a storm like this, there are markers if you know how to read them. And I had to find you. His gaze dropped to her swollen belly, naked longing and fear mingling in his expression. Both of you. Sarah's hand moved to cover his where it rested on the blanket, a gesture of reassurance, of connection, reestablished across months of separation and uncertainty. We're safe, she said softly. For now, at least. Jackson turned away from the intimate moment, busying himself with making coffee, giving them a semblance of privacy in the small confines of the cabin. The practical task helped settle his thoughts, which had been thrown into unexpected turmoil by David's arrival. He had known intellectually that David's return would change the dynamic between himself and Sarah, had understood that whatever unspoken understanding they had developed in their weeks together would be altered by the presence of the man she had loved, first the father of her child. But the reality of it, the tangible shift in Sarah's attention, the way her face had transformed at the sight of David, struck Jackson with an emotional force he hadn't anticipated. He recognized the feeling, unwelcome as it was. Jealousy, a sentiment he had no right to harbor given the circumstances. And yet, there it was, a cold knot in his chest as he watched Sarah tend to David with the gentle attentiveness of a woman caring for someone deeply loved. Coffee, he announced, setting 3 cups on the table with more force than necessary, should help with the warming. David looked up, gratitude plain on his face despite the wariness that still lurked in his eyes. Thank you, Mr. Miles, for everything. He glanced at Sarah, then back to Jackson. She told me how you found her, took her in. I owe you a debt I can never repay. The simple sincerity of the statement made Jackson's jealousy seem petty, unworthy of the man he had tried to be. Anyone would have done the same, he said, echoing the words he had spoken to Sarah days earlier. No, David said firmly, they wouldn't. I've seen enough of the world to know that kindness like yours is rare, especially to strangers. Jackson accepted the acknowledgement with a nod, unable to dispute the truth of it without seeming false. Drink your coffee, he said instead. You need the warmth. The 3 of them sat at the table, an unlikely trinity, bound by circumstances none could have predicted. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the cabin wind, shrieking through the trees like lost souls seeking entrance. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls that seemed to dance in rhythm with the conversation that gradually unfolded. David told his story, how he had fled Willow Gap after Jim Bennett's death, knowing the Bennett name would ensure he never received a fair hearing. How he had hidden in the hills, then worked his way south to Denver, always looking over his shoulder for Thomas Reed's hired guns. I didn't know you were with child, he said to Sarah, regret heavy in his voice. If I had known, I never would have left you alone to face them. You couldn't have known, Sarah assured him. I didn't know myself until weeks later. She hesitated, glancing at Jackson before continuing. And even if you had stayed, it would only have made things worse. Thomas would have had you arrested or worse. Instead, he took his vengeance on you, David said bitterly. When I heard what they'd done leaving you in the snow to die, I nearly rode straight into town to confront him. Would have if a friend hadn't talked sense into me. It would have been suicide, Jackson observed the assessment clinical rather than judgmental. David nodded, acknowledging the truth of it. Reed had spread the word that I'd murdered Jim in cold blood, that Sarah and I had planned it together. There was a bounty on my head in 3 counties. His mouth twisted in a humorless smile. Still is, probably. Then why come back at all? Jackson asked the question that had been nagging at him since he'd recognized David on his porch. Why risk it? David's gaze moved to Sarah, his expression softening. Because some things are worth any risk, he said simply. When I heard Sarah had disappeared, that the town believed she was dead in the hills somewhere, I had to know. Had to find her if there was any chance at all. The naked emotion in his voice, the depth of feeling it revealed, silenced any further questions Jackson might have had. This was a man who had risked his life, his freedom, everything he had for the chance to find the woman he loved. Such devotion was rare and complicated, their situation immeasurably. How did you hear about Sarah? He asked instead, focusing on the practical aspects of David's narrative. Word travels slowly in winter. I have friends in the territory, David explained. Musicians mostly. We look out for each other, pass along information that might be useful. He sipped his coffee, color gradually returning to his face as warmth and rest did their work. One of them heard about a pregnant woman being driven out of Willow Gap. Given the timing and what I knew of Thomas Reed's feelings about Sarah, it wasn't hard to put the pieces together. So you came back, Jackson said, despite the bounty, despite the danger. I had to, David repeated, as if the decision had been inevitable, the only possible choice. And I'm glad I did. His gaze returned to Sarah, worry creasing his brow. You look tired. Are you well? Sarah smiled, though Jackson noted the strain around her eyes, the way she shifted in her seat as if seeking a more comfortable position. Well enough, she said. The baby is active today. A shadow of concern crossed David's face. How much longer? A few weeks, perhaps, Sarah said, her hand moving to her belly in that now familiar protective gesture. Though she seems eager to meet the world. David's expression transformed at the casual revelation, wonder and terror mingling in equal measure. He whispered. A daughter. Sarah's smile softened. Just a feeling, she said, echoing what she had told Jackson days earlier. But yes, I think so. David looked down at his hands, emotion overwhelming him momentarily. When he looked up again, his eyes glistened with unshed tears. A daughter. He repeated the words, a prayer of gratitude and fear. Jackson rose from the table, unable to bear witness to this intimate moment between two people whose lives were so deeply intertwined. I'll check the perimeter, he said, reaching for his coat. Make sure no one else decided to brave the storm. It was an excuse, and they all knew it. No one would be out in this weather. David's journey had been exceptional, driven by a desperation few would share. But the pretense gave Jackson a reason to step outside to find space to breathe and think in the cold clarity of the storm. Be careful, Sarah called after him, concern evident in her voice despite the distraction of David's presence. Jackson nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and stepped out into the howling night. The cold struck him like a physical blow, the wind driving snow against his face with needle-sharp intensity. He pulled his hat low, tucked his chin into his collar, and made his way carefully around the cabin, checking windows and doors more from habit than necessity. The storm was reaching its peak. He judged the world beyond the small circle of light from the cabin's windows, reduced to a chaotic swirl of white. No one would travel in this, not Reed, not his men, not even the law. For tonight at least they were safe from external threats. It was the internal complications that concerned him now. David's arrival had upended whatever tentative future Jackson had begun to imagine. The unspoken possibility that had been growing between himself and Sarah, the quiet moments by the fire, the shared meals, the gradual easing of her wariness and his isolation, all of it seemed suddenly like a dream from which he had abruptly awakened. Of course she would choose David. He was the father of her child, the man she had loved before circumstances tore them apart. Their reunion was the resolution of a story interrupted, not the beginning of something new. Jackson had been a temporary shelter, nothing more. A way station on Sarah's journey back to the life she should have had, the love she had never truly abandoned. The realization shouldn't have hurt as much as it did. He had known from the beginning that Sarah's presence in his cabin was temporary, that once the baby was born and she was strong enough to travel, she would leave. He had prepared himself for that eventuality. What he hadn't prepared for was the hollow ache that now settled beneath his ribs, the sense of loss for something he had never really possessed. It was foolish, this pain, unworthy of the man he had tried to be since Eleanor's death. And yet there it was, as real and biting as the storm that swirled around him. He completed his circuit of the cabin, finding nothing amiss as expected. At the door he paused, steeling himself to return to the scene inside to Sarah and David, to their reunion, and the plans they would inevitably make together. Plans that would not include him. But before he could reach for the latch, the door swung open, and David Calloway stood framed in the light, his expression urgent. "It's Sarah," he said, fear evident in his voice. "Something's wrong." Jackson pushed past him, without a word, shedding his snow-crusted coat as he moved swiftly to where Sarah sat by the fire. One look at her face, pale, drawn with pain, a thin sheen of sweat on her brow, despite the cabin's chill, told him everything he needed to know. "How long?" he asked, professional instinct taking over as he knelt beside her. "Since this morning," she admitted, grimacing as another contraction seized her. "But they were miles far apart. I thought it was just false labor." "And now," he prompted, taking her wrist to check her pulse. "Closer together. Stronger." She met his gaze, fear and determination mingling in her eyes. "It's too early, isn't it?" Jackson considered the question, mentally calculating dates based on what Sarah had told him. "A few weeks," he acknowledged, "but not dangerously so. Many first babies come early." David hovered nearby, his face a mask of helpless concern. "Is there anything I can do?" He asked, the question directed at Jackson rather than Sarah. Jackson assessed the situation quickly. Sarah in labor, a storm raging outside, no possibility of summoning help or reaching town. They would have to manage alone, the three of them in a cabin barely adequate for the purpose. "Water," he said, falling back on the practical necessities of birth. "Heat as much as we have. Clean cloths if you can find them. And make sure the fire stays high, we'll need the warmth." David nodded, grateful for direction, for some way to be useful in a situation where his love for Sarah counted less than Jackson's medical experience. He moved to the stove, filling the large kettle with water from the bucket by the door. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered as another contraction passed, leaving her gasping. "I should have told you earlier, but with everything happening, David's arrival, I thought—" "It doesn't matter now," Jackson assured her, his personal feelings set aside in the face of her immediate need. "We'll manage. I've delivered babies before in worse conditions than this. Field hospitals during the war, makeshift tents, where wounded men lay dying while new life struggled to enter the world a few feet away. Women following their soldier husbands, caught by birth pangs in the midst of army camps. Yes, he had seen birth in all its raw, messy glory, had helped bring children into the world when circumstances were far from ideal. But none of those births had mattered to him personally the way this one did. None had carried the weight of his own complicated emotions, his unresolved feelings for the mother, his uncertain place in the life of the child to come. Sarah nodded, trusting him despite the fear that lingered in her eyes. "Tell me what to do," she said, her voice steadier now that action was required. Jackson outlined the process ahead of them, his tone calm and assured, despite the anxiety that twisted in his gut. Birth was natural, he reminded himself. Women had been doing it since the beginning of humanity, often without medical assistance. Sarah was young, healthy, despite her recent ordeal. There was every reason to believe the birth would proceed normally, and yet fear lingered, memories of Eleanor's death casting a shadow over his clinical certainty. He had failed to save his wife and child. What if he failed Sarah as well? He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the practical tasks at hand. The bed was prepared with clean linens, the fire built high water, heating on the stove. David moved with quiet efficiency, following Jackson's instructions without question, his concern for Sarah overriding any potential awkwardness between the two men. As the hours passed, the storm's fury seemed to match Sarah's labor, intensifying, receding, then building again with renewed strength. She walked when she could, rested when she couldn't, her face a study in determination despite the pain that left her gasping in weak-kneed. David stayed by her side, supporting her weight during the worst contractions, wiping her brow with a damp cloth, murmuring encouragement that seemed to give her strength even as her body weakened with the effort of bringing new life into the world. Jackson observed them together, noting the natural way they moved in tandem, the unspoken understanding that passed between them with a glance or a touch. They had a history, these two. A connection forged before tragedy and circumstance intervened. Watching them, Jackson felt more acutely than ever his status as an outsider, a temporary figure in a story that had begun long before his involvement and would continue long after. Yet when the critical moment came, when Sarah's labor intensified to the point where walking was impossible, when her cries became more desperate and her strength began to flag, it was to Jackson she turned her hand, reaching for his with an urgency that transcended politeness. "Don't leave me," she gasped as a particularly strong contraction seized her. "Please. I'm here," he assured her, his larger hand enveloping hers, steady, despite the emotions churning beneath his calm exterior. "I'm not going anywhere." And he wasn't. Whatever his personal feelings, whatever complications lay ahead in this moment, his place was clear. Sarah needed him not just his medical knowledge, but his strength, his steadiness, the quiet confidence he had built over years of facing crisis with calm resolve. David stood on her other side, holding her free hand, his face a mirror of her pain and determination. "You can do this," he told her, his voice rough with emotion. "You're the strongest person I've ever known." Sarah managed to smile through her exhaustion, a fleeting expression that vanished as another contraction took hold. "Tell me that again," she gasped when it had passed. "When this is over." The hours blurred together as the labor progressed, marking time, not in minutes but in contractions, in Sarah's increasingly desperate cries and the gradual revelation that this birth, like all births, was a battle as much as a miracle. Outside, the storm began to abate, the wind's howl diminishing to a mournful sigh. Inside, a different kind of storm reached its peak as Sarah's body prepared for the final stage of labor. "It's time," Jackson told her, his assessment based on physical signs and her own instinctive knowledge. "When the next contraction comes, I need you to push." Sarah nodded beyond speech, now her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. David supported her from behind his arms, encircling her shoulders, providing what strength he could as she gathered herself for the final effort. "Now," Jackson instructed as the contraction began, his hands ready to guide the child into the world. "Push, Sarah, as hard as you can." She did, a cry of effort in pain escaping her clenched teeth. Once, twice, three times she pushed, each effort bringing the baby closer to birth, each momentary respite allowing her to gather what little strength remained. "I can see the head." "Oh, so," Jackson told her, encouragement in his voice despite the tension that knotted his shoulders. "One more big push, Sarah. Just one more." With a final desperate effort, Sarah bore down, her cry transforming into something primal and fierce, the sound of a woman reaching the limits of endurance and pushing beyond them through sheer will. And then suddenly it was done. The baby slipped into Jackson's waiting hands, tiny, imperfect, and angry at being thrust from the warm darkness of the womb into the cold light of the world. A girl just as Sarah had predicted. Small but perfectly formed, with a shock of dark hair plastered to her head, and lungs that worked with impressive efficiency, filling the cabin with the indignant wail of new life. "A daughter, Saban," Jackson announced, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "Healthy and strong." He cleaned the baby quickly, efficiently, years of medical training taking over despite the trembling in his hands. When she was wrapped in the soft cloth they had prepared, he placed her in Sarah's waiting arms, stepping back to give mother and child and father their first moments together. Sarah looked down at her daughter with wonder, exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the miracle of holding her child at last. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tracing a gentle finger along the baby's cheek. "Welcome to the world." David leaned over them both, his face transformed by a joy so profound it was almost painful to witness. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "Like her mother." It was a tableau of family, of connection and belonging, and Jackson felt suddenly acutely out of place. His part in this drama was over. He had delivered the child, safely had seen mother and daughter through the dangers of birth. Now it was time to step back, to acknowledge that his role had always been temporary, a bridge between Sarah's past and the future she would build with David and their daughter. He moved away quietly, giving them the privacy of their reunion while he attended to the practical aftermath of birth. There were things to be cleaned, preparations to be made for Sarah's recovery tasks that allowed him to be useful without intruding on the intimate moment unfolding by the fire. But as he worked, his gaze kept returning to the small family tableau, to Sarah, exhausted but radiant, to David, his face a study in wonder and protective love, to the tiny girl whose arrival had transformed them all in ways they were only beginning to understand. And despite everything, despite the knowledge that his part in their story was ending, despite the hollow ache that knowledge brought, Jackson felt a quiet satisfaction that transcended his personal loss. He had helped bring this child safely into the world, had provided shelter when Sarah needed it most, had in his own way been part of creating something good and true in a world too often marked by cruelty and indifference. It would have to be enough. Dawn broke clear and cold, a storm having spent its fury during the night. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's windows, illuminating a scene of exhausted peace. Sarah asleep in the bed, the baby nestled beside her, David dozing in the chair by the fire, and Jackson at the table keeping watch over them all, with gritty eyes and a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. He had not slept, could not, with the responsibility of monitoring mother and child through those crucial first hours. But now, with morning's arrival and both Sarah and the baby resting comfortably, the exhaustion of the long night caught up with him, settling into his bones with leaden insistence. David stirred, awareness returning gradually as sunlight touched his face. He straightened in the chair, wincing at muscles stiffened by awkward rest, and glanced immediately toward the bed where Sarah and his daughter slept. Reassured of their safety, he turned to Jackson, gratitude and something like embarrassment mingling in his expression. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I'll watch over them." Jackson nodded, too tired to argue, even if he had been inclined to. "Wake me if anything changes," he said, rising stiffly from the table. "If Sarah develops a fever, or if the baby seems distressed in any way." "I will," David promised. He hesitated, then added, "Thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." The sincerity in his voice was genuine, Jackson knew. Whatever complications existed between them, whatever unspoken competition or resentment might have festered under different circumstances, in this moment, David's gratitude was real and earned. "Take care of them," Jackson said, simply moving to the pallet he had prepared near the hearth. It was all that needed saying, all that could be said, without venturing into territory neither man was ready to explore. David nodded, understanding the layers beneath the simple instruction. "I will," he repeated, a vow more than a reassurance. Jackson lay down his body, surrendering to exhaustion, even as his mind continued to circle around the events of the night, the implications of the morning, the uncertain future that awaited them all. Sleep claimed him despite these preoccupations, dragging him into a darkness deeper than thought or worry could penetrate. When he woke, the quality of light had changed the harsh brightness of morning, giving way to the softer glow of afternoon. He lay still for a moment, orienting himself, assessing the cabin's atmosphere before opening his eyes fully. Quiet conversation reached him. Sarah's voice weaker than usual but steady. David's deeper tones, pitched low as if mindful of disturbing the baby. They were discussing names, Jackson realized. Names for their daughter born in storm and isolation, her future as uncertain as the winter sky. "Melody," Sarah suggested, a smile in her voice despite her exhaustion. "For her father's music." "Hope," David countered, "because that's what she is, what she's always been even before she was born." "Melody Hope," Sarah compromised, "a song of possibility." David's laugh, soft and warm, filled the cabin with a sound so foreign to its walls that Jackson felt his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. How long had it been since laughter, real, unguarded joy, had echoed in this space? Not since Eleanor, surely. Not in all the years of solitude that followed her death. He sat up, making enough noise to alert them to his wakefulness without startling the baby. Sarah looked over from the bed, her face pale, but her eyes bright with a happiness that transcended physical discomfort. "Jackson," she said, gesturing him closer, "come meet Melody Hope properly. You were too busy last night to really look at her." He approached the bed, conscious of David watching from his position in the chair nearby. The baby lay in the crook of Sarah's arm, swaddled in the soft blanket Jackson had purchased in town, her tiny face peaceful in sleep. "She's beautiful," he said, meaning it. All babies were miracles in their way, but this one, born of storm and secrecy, delivered by his own hands, held a special significance he couldn't quite articulate. "She has David's chin," Sarah observed, touching the baby's face with gentle fingers. "And my mother's nose, I think." Jackson nodded, though he could see little family resemblance in the newborn's features. That would come later as she grew, as her face took on the characteristics of her lineage. If she was allowed to grow, he reminded himself. If Thomas Reed didn't succeed in his determination to claim her, to separate her from the parents who already loved her with fierce devotion. The thought sobered him, bringing back the reality they still faced. The storm had provided a temporary reprieve, but it wouldn't last. Once the snow cleared enough for travel, Reed would make his move. And they needed to be ready. Needed a plan that accounted for Sarah's weakened state, for the newborn's vulnerability, for the legal and physical threats that awaited them. "We need to talk," he said, shifting his gaze from the baby to Sarah's face. "About what happens next." Sarah's expression sobered, the purity of new motherhood momentarily overshadowed by the dangers they still faced. "Yes," she agreed, "we do." David straightened in his chair, his posture alert despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. "Reed won't wait long," he said, giving voice to the concern they all shared. "As soon as he hears about the baby, he'll move." "And he will hear," Jackson confirmed. "Word travels fast even in winter. Someone will notice the smoke from our chimney, the tracks in the snow. We'll put together that the baby has arrived." Sarah's arms tightened protectively around her daughter. "Then we need to be gone before that happens," she said, the steel beneath her soft exterior evident in her voice. "As soon as I'm strong enough to travel." "That's days away at least," Jackson cautioned. "Maybe longer. Birth takes a toll, even when everything goes well. And winter travel with a newborn," he left the implications unspoken. "We can't stay here." David said the statement, not a criticism, but a reality they all recognized. "Reed knows where to find us. And now that Melody is born, he has legal grounds to pursue his claim, fictitious as it might be." The use of the baby's name, the acknowledgement of her as a person, not just an abstract complication, struck Jackson with unexpected force. Melody Hope, a child born of love and desperation into a world already set against her. She deserved better than to become a pawn in Thomas Reed's schemes, better than to be separated from parents who would cherish her. There's a hunting cabin, he said, the decision forming even as he spoke. About a day's ride north of here in the high country. Remote, difficult to find if you don't know where to look. I use it sometimes in summer, when game is scarce in the lower elevations. Sarah and David exchanged a glance, hope kindling in their expressions. Is it habitable in winter? David asked, the practical question of a man who had survived enough hardship to know the difference between desperate measures and suicide. Basic, Jackson acknowledged. One room like this one, a fireplace, a rough bed, but solid walls, a good roof. And so isolated that Reed would never think to look there even if he knew of its existence. Which he doesn't, Sarah said, understanding the implication. No one does except you. Jackson nodded. I've kept it private. A retreat when this cabin feels too exposed. The irony wasn't lost on any of them that Jackson's refuge from occasional human contact might now serve as their sanctuary from very specific human threat. How soon could we leave? David asked, already calculating distances. Supplies the logistics of a journey with a newborn and a woman newly delivered. 3 days, Jackson said after brief consideration. Maybe 4. Depends on how quickly Sarah regains her strength and how the trails clear after the storm. 3 days, Sarah repeated, determination hardening her voice. I'll be ready. Jackson studied her face, noting the pallor beneath her resolved expression, the shadows of exhaustion that birth had carved around her eyes. Don't push too hard, he cautioned. Recovery takes time. Time we may not have, she reminded him. I'd rather face the discomfort of early travel than the certainty of losing my daughter to Thomas Reed. And there was no arguing with her logic or with the fierce maternal protection that underlay it. Jackson nodded, accepting her decision, even as he made mental notes to monitor her condition closely in the coming days. We'll need supplies, David said, moving on to practical considerations. Food, extra blankets for the baby, medicines. He glanced at Jackson. Another trip to town. Jackson considered the question, weighing the risks against the necessities. Yes, he decided, but carefully, in and out only the essentials. And I'll spread word that Sarah's still waiting for the baby, buy us a few extra days of preparation. Will they believe that? Sarah asked, doubt evident in her voice. After last night's storm, the timing. People believe what fits their expectations, Jackson said, echoing Sheriff Porter's observation from days earlier. And no one expects a woman to travel so soon after giving birth, especially in winter. It's a believable delay. David nodded, accepting the strategy. When will you go? Tomorrow, Jackson decided. Early, before the town is fully awake. Less chance of running into Reed or his men. The plan was taking shape, a desperate gamble, but with higher stakes than any of them had ever played for. A newborn's future, a mother's right to her child, a father's chance to know his daughter. And for Jackson, something less tangible but no less important, the knowledge that he had done everything possible to protect what he had helped bring into the world. What about afterwards? Sarah asked, voicing the question that hung unspoken between them. After we reach the hunting cabin, after we're safe from Reed, what then? The we in her question was deliberate, Jackson knew. She and David and Melody, a family unit formed by love and circumstance, bound by ties stronger than legal documents or social conventions. Where did he fit in that equation, if at all? One step at a time, he said, sidestepping the larger question. First, we get you safely to the cabin. Then we decide the next move. It was a postponement rather than an answer, but neither Sarah nor David pressed him. They all understood the immediacy of their current situation, the need to focus on survival before considering longer-term plans. Melody stirred in Sarah's arms, tiny fists waving as she woke from her nap. Her face scrunched in preparation for a cry, but Sarah anticipated her needs, adjusting her position to nurse the hungry infant. The simple, ancient act of a mother feeding her child brought a momentary peace to the cabin, a reminder that despite danger and uncertainty, life continued its essential rhythms. Jackson turned away, giving them privacy, his gaze falling on the window, where afternoon sunlight streamed through in golden bars. The storm had passed, leaving a world-transformed snow. Piled in drifts against the cabin walls, trees bowed under white burdens, the landscape scoured clean of imperfection by winter's harsh hand. Beautiful but dangerous in its beauty, like the path ahead of them fraught with risk, but offering the possibility of something worth the journey, safety, freedom, a future unburdened by Thomas Reed's schemes or Willow Gap's judgment. They would leave in 3 days, traveling north into the high country, where isolation offered protection. where a mother and father could begin to know their daughter without fear or interference, where decisions about the future could be made in safety, not desperation. And Jackson, he would guide them. There would ensure their security, would do whatever was necessary to protect the small family that had formed under his roof. Beyond that, he wouldn't plan. Some journeys revealed their purpose only in the traveling, not in the destination imagined beforehand. Outside, a raven called harshly from a nearby pine, the sound echoing across the snow-covered clearing. A harbinger, perhaps, or merely a wild creature going about its business in a world indifferent to human concerns. Either way, the die was cast. In 3 days, they would leave the relative safety of the cabin for the uncertain promise of the hunting lodge. Would risk everything on the hope that Thomas Reed's reach had limits, that the bonds of love were stronger than the power of money and influence. It was a gamble, Jackson knew. But looking at Sarah and David, at tiny Melody nursing contentedly in her mother's arms, he also knew it was a gamble worth taking. Some things, as David had said, were worth any risk. The future would unfold as it would. For now, it was enough to have a plan, a purpose, a path forward through the wilderness of uncertainty. For now, it was enough.